Hello, welcome to my stream tonight. Took a week off last week because I was feeling pretty sick, but I am back now. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about deployment. Honestly, this is a subject that I was terribly well versed with, at least with modern topics, until recently because of the work I've been doing. Um, but recently, because of that work, Solid Start, doing different integrations, I've had a chance to play around with deployment, specifically, obviously, for Solid. But it's kind of, enlightened me to the way, things like Vercel, Netlify, and Cloudflare work. So I just want to kind of share what I've learned, kind of show how I'm using it with Solid, and kind of maybe talk a bit about where things are heading. But before we get too deep into it, probably good to talk a little bit about this week in JavaScript, which I wish I was a little bit more prepared for. Just give me 2 seconds here. I was actually going back and forth with Sebastian from the React core team for a little bit here. He had some interesting questions and thoughts about Solid, and this all came up because someone posted a question. How, like, it wasn't even a question. They're like, I think it's terrible or sucks that you can't do conditional hooks in React. And I don't know. I actually don't think it sucks. I think it's actually really good that we can't do conditional hooks. And I know that might seem weird to some people because, flexibility, and I'm always talking about, the benefits of reactivity and how we can nest things and do that. But I actually think that a lot of the cases that Solid can do that React can't do don't actually really matter. Obviously, there's some nice benefits to being able to nest some things and be able to define state wherever you want. But for the most part, it isn't really that relevant. Your data is declarative. There's rules. You want to kind of set the system up so that it's like a reactive graph, like that everything just works as data updates. And it's the same with whatever framework you choose. So I think that I think it's not really that big of a deal. I mean, it was interesting because obviously some people from the Svelte crowd came out and were like, oh, we don't have hook rules and all this, but it's not like you can nest $ labels, right? Like, you can't just write in an if statement. And as I said, it's funny because, as I said, Solid can do these things, but I don't even think that makes a ton of sense. So there you go. I'm giving concession to React. All right. Let's see. Has anyone joined our stream so far? Or am I just rambling to myself? If you're here, feel free to say hi. I know it's been a couple weeks. It's always hard when you lose momentum. I was doing this every Friday, but you get sick. What can you do? I guess the last stream was 2 weeks ago. So that was like what, October 29th, before Halloween even. Hey, Dan. We've had a lot of things happen since October 29th. So I've actually got a little bit extra to talk about for this week in JavaScript, so to speak. So let's go there, and let me share my screen here and look at that for a moment. What are we on? Okay, so I'm on Twitter. It's my easiest way. Let's just look, because honestly, a lot's happened that I barely even remember. Let's go back to the beginning, right? October. Yeah, I guess the last thing that I've talked about was I kind of sniped out that awesome demo for Solid with Vercel using edge functions, and basically put it out exactly the same week that Next.js was released. So it was a really nice demo for Solid. If you haven't seen it, check it out. But let's move on from there. I actually, what was I going to say? I actually had a conference talk for Holy.js, which you guys probably didn't see because you have to pay for it. So that's unfortunate. So let's go to the next big thing. React Router 6 is out. Oh, hi. A few more people have joined the stream, I see. I think that's awesome. Honestly, as you all know, React Router 6 was a big influence on Solid's router. It's the core of Remix in the same way Solid Start, the router is the core of it. And I've mentioned this a few times before. We were already kind of working on the same sort of thing and the same kind of vision. And when saw React Router 6, thanks to Remix actually, realized that they'd solved this problem that I was having, basically reconcile putting together both the file system-based routing and the component-based routing. For me, I guess with Solid, the most interesting thing about React Router 6 is now, when people want to know how Solid Router works, I can point them to a doc site. No, we're going to get some good docs for Solid Router, but generally speaking, React Router 6 and Solid Router have almost identical APIs. So it's a big move forward to have it out there. Yeah, I don't need to talk too much about this. I had some fun doing some comparisons between Angular and RxJS, or sorry, Angular and RxJS with Solid. I don't think that's too interesting. But yeah, another kind of key thing that, in case you guys weren't aware of for Solid, was I took that same Vercel demo and deployed it to Netlify. So there we go. I've got Cloudflare, Netlify, and Vercel for this Hacker News demo. So that's what we're going to look at a little later today when I talk about deployments. And we're also going to look at just deploying simple templates like the ones you'd use if you just run one of our starter templates from dgit or whatever. The other thing, yes, yeah, let's talk about this for a moment. In case anyone cares, this has been the hot thing this week. And the timing is probably a little bit awkward or whatnot. Basically, at Jamstack a month ago, Rich Harris gave a talk about this concept of transitional apps. And if you've seen a couple of my previous streams, I was kind of like, you know, I think a lot of good points were made in that talk, but I just didn't understand how, SvelteKit or Next or whatever is getting bundled in with this group of other frameworks working on this stuff. And I was like, okay, whatever. It's Rich's talk. Who cares? Svelte does and SvelteKit does amazing things. Reduces code size, as I showed in the previous stream. Like it's doing a lot of progressive things. I think it's really pushing things forward. And I was just going to leave it at that. But then, interestingly enough, which it's funny, everything seems tied together. Rich Harris got a job at Vercel to work on Svelte full time, which, as I said, I actually think that's probably the biggest news. Super exciting to see where that goes, because he's wanted to do more for a while and he just hasn't had the opportunity. But it also meant that when that broke, all the news articles and stuff that he was talking about, and mentioned Vercel to, could finally be shared, which meant that a bunch of press came out at the same time. And one of those things was an article where it talked about transitional apps again. And I was just like, yeah, this isn't going away. I want to pull this out and kind of examine this a bit. And what it comes down to is, and again, I've touched on this on previous streams, is there is a classic MPA crowd, right? Like multi-page app crowd who are there, and basically they generally don't like build steps, don't like JavaScript frameworks, and are always critical, and basically say that they treat single page apps as kind of like irresponsible children. And maybe that's a fair depiction, maybe, but it's definitely something that irks Rich Harris, because he cares about this stuff. That with the news, he cares about progressive enhancement. He cares about delivering experiences to the lowest end devices. He cares about small bundle JavaScript bundle sizes and all this. He wants the web to be accessible. That's what it comes down to, and everything he does shows that. Whether it's making the code accessible and easy, or whether it's making the experiences not suffer for that. So, I'll say, you can hear my voice, I have a lot of admiration for the work that Rich does. The thing is, those Yeah, I mean, yes, exactly. Thanks, Dylan. Yeah, how could you, right? And the thing is, knowing that, I understand where this all comes from, right? Because the MPA people are unfairly characterizing something that Rich and many others actually are devoting themselves to working towards and making things better. So here I am, kind of sweeping it under the car, like not sweeping the carpet, kind of sweeping the legs under. Why am I attacking this transitional JavaScript app thing? Not because I don't agree with the sentiment, not because I don't think it's important, and it's just that if you make the umbrella too wide, you basically pull in all the single page app frameworks, Next.js. If you want to talk about modern frameworks that send 100 kilobytes for a hello world, I mean, there's one. And that's fine. Like different uses, different things, and obviously there's different kinds of ways you can attack this. But a lot of innovation's been coming on the multi-page app front, which, as I said, is ironic because the multi-page app is sort of the are where a lot of the criticisms coming from. But we have a whole new generation of multi-page app, and it's funny to call it new because I work on Marco team's been doing this since 2014. But between Astro, Isle, Elder, the Slinkity I learned about today, there's like half a dozen frameworks trying to push the barrier of using partial hydration and islands, and this actually reduces JavaScript. Server-side rendering on its own did not reduce JavaScript. Sure, you can just be like, okay, I server-side render it, so I don't need to send any JavaScript. But that we're building apps. If that was your whole ambition in life, you could just make a static HTML page. No, there will be interactivity, and that's where it's important. When you do need to add that JavaScript, you do have that button, and it's actually these MPA frameworks, and they've had a hard time getting traction for years. They've had a hard time getting traction, and obviously I work on one, but as soon as Astro started kind of coming in the scene, I talked to Fred, and he was like, I love that you talk about our frameworks openly and kind of get it out there because it's hard. Let's talk about common terminology. I present Astro and everyone's like, so it's like Next.js. And it's like, no, it's not like Next.js, right? I've talked to different materials. Misko Hevery, he's got some great ideas with Quick that might be possibly the most cutting edge thing we've seen in terms of this ability to transition between multi-page app and single page app. And he's convinced that no one actually understands what he's doing. I don't think that's the case. I think some people do understand what he's doing, but there's too much of like a me too thinking around frameworks. People need, their framework to be everything for everyone, that no one's is really acknowledging and pointing out that Quick is doing something amazing that we have not seen before. And that's all I kind of wanted to bring to the surface. I posted this, and some people are like, "Oh, why are you trying to undermine Rich? He's trying to move web dev forward and get people moving in the right direction." I know, I respect that. I'm just saying is look at who responded, retweeted, and liked what I posted. It's all the authors of the frameworks that. It's funny. Let's look. What did I say? Unpopular opinion. There's currently only one transitional app framework in existence today, QuickDev, and any attempt to try to paint SvelteKit or Next or Solid as somehow different than SPA is basically hollow marketing. Okay, pretty harsh, let's say. But look at this. Let's see who retweeted it. Okay. Well, this one's newer. I didn't see this, but Matt Phillips from Astro, Misko from Quick. I mean, these aren't even people working on Quick, and this is a Quick tweet. Who we got? Dylan Piercy, Marco, Builder, Quick. Okay, a lot of Quick people. Obviously, they liked it. But my point is, it wasn't just Quick. It was Astros in there, myself, Marco. People working on these solutions are working hard on these solutions. And to kind of be like, oh, so you're like SvelteKit? I mean, there's nothing wrong with SvelteKit. But these are different technologies, and they're different things working in different zones. And it's hard because I don't expect the average framework consumer to actually know that or understand that, and it's fine. We haven't done a good job explaining it. This is a technical nuance, and I'm going to try my best you know, and I'm not on the stream. I'm just in general. I'm going to try my best to explain this and help people kind of see what's going on, because there is a lot of really cool things going on. It's not there yet. We haven't finished the picture. So under that, sure, we can rally behind this banner that Rich has made for us, using his influence. But when it comes down to it, these are drastically different approaches that are actually incompatible with single page apps today, right? I know there's this hope that, I'm just going to see how the dust settles, is actually how Rich put it. He's like, I appreciate, he's like, I think there's higher priority things for Svelte. And honestly, where Svelte and SvelteKit is, I'd agree. There's huge adoption happening. Like they're getting to a point where they can make a run at legitimately being like a key player in frameworks, right? Don't waste your time doing this kind of R&D. But some people are doing it, and they don't like perhaps maybe being lumped in. Like the whole thing they've been trying to solve is not to be lumped in with those single page apps. Yeah, I mean, that's my piece. Some of you at least came here to hear me rant a little bit, right? How's everyone doing in the chat? I see a couple people joined on now more, so looks like we're probably where we need to be for this week in JavaScript. Oh, sorry, yeah, here's another one from Astro. Yeah, I don't think there's much more to kind of go over for JavaScript. So let's see if we can switch gears. And as this is going to be pretty solid focus, but let me give you all a little back history here. The last time that I was doing freelancing and really got into deployment before now, it was Heroku. Heroku was basically has changed the scene. And I think, you know what, actually, let me throw a banner up so that I can easier make this cut point. Give me 2 seconds here. Oh, what the hell? Banners have folders now? Forget it. Okay. Never mind. I'm just going to get started on this. Sorry, I'm just reading the comments here. I missed some good interactions. I hate Twitter, but I learn a lot from the rants. I'm here to rant myself. Good thing, Dylan. Anyways, so back to where I was going here. Essentially, back when I was doing, random sites and doing random projects, I was basically on Heroku, and anyone who's used Heroku back then know that it was a game changer. Like it completely, like before that, like back in the original day of web, I was using FTP and dropping in static files. And that, I think I talked about my guest book in Perl scripts and my site that looked as awesome as Space Jam 1996, or at least in my mind, it looked that awesome. But essentially, beyond that, you had these, servers and running these machines. I remember my first job I actually got as a QA. Part of the reason they hired me was because I was decently good running hardware, because I did a lot of like computer repairs. So I had to run our whole test stuff locally, like on actual machines. And I'm not going to talk about Docker, which came much later, or Kubernetes, or any of that kind of deployment technology. Not really. But essentially, and it would take it down, run your scripts, and that was great. Then for work, I basically was on AWS, and I was on AWS for almost a decade, and I did not pay attention to anything else going on. Mostly I was just provisioning EC2 instances, and AWS is great because it has a lot of really small instances. You get these nano instances for like $5 a month, at least back in the day, or probably cheaper in the US, actually. I'm talking Canadian prices. And you could just like spin up as many machines as you wanted and make a microservice architecture. Later, got into Lambda functions and even edge functions with AWS. So I basically hadn't touched any of this stuff for years. But to my surprise, I kind of came back around and I was like, okay, what can I do here? So the first thing I did is I started using GitHub pages to build static sites. And honestly, it's easy, but also kind of sucks. So I'm kind of glad that these other solutions exist. So let's first here talk a little bit about Netlify, because even though Cloudflare was the first integration I did for Solid Start, Netlify, as you know, approached us and actually wanted to help Solid get started. And they have this button that just goes on repos and lets you deploy instantly. And honestly, our starter templates should have that button, but they do not, because our starter templates are in a mono repo, which it doesn't support. But actually got something great to share with you all. There's actually a Solid Netlify starter, if that's your flavor. Solid, not that one. Solid. It's the problem with Solid Start, and I'm meddled with it. But honestly, I have. This is not GitHub. I hate this. Why do my search results not give me GitHub? It gives me like some stupid. Okay, whatever. It's like I've never met or talked to Charlie Gerard directly, but they have my thanks because wrote the CSS tricks article, which is, as I consider, one of the best starter articles for Solid, and they also made this lovely Netlify starter that literally just took our standard V template and added this deploy to Netlify button. And this is just our standard V template. You've all seen it before, but what's sweet these days is you can basically now just put a button on a template and presto, gets set up with Netlify in 1 minute. Solid.js Netlify starter. Sounds good. Save and deploy. Honestly, I've never done this, so I guess we get to see if this, how fast this is or what this is like. But essentially, and it's not actually that much. It's that different from doing this manually, to be fair. What you can just install the Netlify CLI and just run it. But yeah, essentially, one button click deploys with Netlify, which I think is really cool. And I want to see what this actually works and goes with. Of course, as I said, I've never done this, so there's like a non-zero chance this just blows up in my face like most things on stream. But hey, let's give this a shot and we can look at it. I'm also going to talk specifically about what we did for Netlify with Solid Start. But I just thought it'd be nice to kind of look at what it's actually like when you just start with a random GitHub starter. And as I said, this is basically our starter template. So if you know that you want to deploy to Netlify, it's the perfect place to start, assuming this works. All right. Now, this could be my internet connection slow, but I've never done this. I don't know. Has anyone else ever pressed one of these deploy buttons? Is it usually a fast process? Anyone know? Maybe not. Maybe that's why you're here. While I'm at this, let's just open up Netlify, because I do have a Netlify account, which hopefully will just log me in. And I do have a couple things in here. And God, this is why you do stuff before stream, so you don't make things look bad. Who wants to guess that this has actually locked us up? They say 1 minute. Okay. It's a good advertisement. All right, they say right on the read. Maybe it's like literally 1 minute. I should be counting the 60 seconds down. I didn't get like a little egg timer. Yeah, I'm not getting anywhere here, am I? Okay, no, that's tomorrow. I was like, maybe I'm doing it during a maintenance window. Not seeing it show up here. Okay, I'm gonna give this one more shot, just because. Oh, this is probably like the terriblest thing to do. I'm just gonna change the name here just in case. Okay, yeah. That type error from the deploy. I mean, it hits the second I press the save button. I don't think I'm going to, like I yeah, I wonder if it's just something up with the repo that's configured wrong and I haven't tried this, or, like, it's something updated. I was hoping I could just take the solid starter and kind of show it off, but maybe not. I've also done some manual deploys here, as you can see, um, which we can look at in a minute. Yeah, yeah. Let's maybe shift gears. I was hoping this would just be like an easy win, an easy place to start. Okay, let's look at. I want to talk a little bit about solid start and the Hacker News example. I'm going to switch into my Netlify branch because I want to start there. Um, Solid Hacker News, Netlify. Cool. Now, I've shown off solid start previously on the stream a little bit, but I think it's kind of this is the piece that's missing that sort of completes the puzzles. There we go. Let's kind of full screen this. All right, yeah. It's complaining about that. Okay. Some invisible files from Vercel. I keep on switching around, but let's just get started. So, Solid Start app for Hacker News is pretty simplistic. It has a root component and suspense around the different routes, and we have these pages. I think I've showcased this before. I'm gonna blow up my screen a little bit, but essentially, the way adapters work for Solid and for the Netlify plugin is essentially you just import the solid start Netlify. And I'm just going to update my node modules here to get that in. So npm run install, npm run build. So essentially for Netlify, this folder looks like this. And it essentially has a functions folder where I actually dump in our source code. And it has the rest of it is actually the standard Vite output. But our server code ends up in this functions folder. And that's what the Netlify adapter generates for you. And the way Netlify works, and I can kind of pull this up here, is twofold. Essentially, and this is getting a little bit here. So I'll start Netlify. Their entry point looks like this, where they get for their functions, they get an event and basically and a context, and you basically have to put it on an export.handler. Seeing this immediately was really familiar for me, probably not familiar for everyone else. I could tell immediately that Netlify uses AWS under the hood, because this is actually basically identical to how you write Lambda functions in AWS. So for me, for Solid Start, this was actually really easy. All I had to do was check the method. If it's a post, render actions, which I talked about before for Solid Start. But the main code was actually really simple. I essentially just call the render function for Solid Start, which is an alias over streaming or not streaming. In our case, Netlify actually doesn't support streaming because AWS does not support streaming. So this is just a render to string async under the hood, and we pass in our manifest for preloading and our URL. But essentially, to get Netlify working as a function, all you need for this is just this async function handler, and then handle the event, call render on it, which could be rendered to string async, take that HTML, return it to the body with a status code. Part A. Part B is you need a Netlify toml, which is set up to tell it where the functions are, which I told you was dysfunctions, and it redirects everything / to that function. That was essentially all I needed to do to get Solid Start working here. And I wanted to show the other example because the other example was the spa example. That's the easy one, right? Using it's not going to work. Using Netlify to create a static site with just like a client rendered single page app is super simple because you can just basically point it to the dist folder. It'll run the build command for you and it'll do everything really, really easily. But to do a function is a little bit more complicated because you need to handle the redirects yourself, and you basically need to define a handler in a functions folder. And if I go down to the bottom of this is all my compiled code. I used rollup and beat to generate this, but you can see this is just our same thing. That's basically all there is to Netlify. If you have any kind of questions about it, it is identical to AWS essentially. So that's the gist for Netlify. I'm sort of disappointed that the simple example ended up not working the way I wanted it to. We could probably just go open up a solid starter app locally and just deploy to Netlify to kind of see what that would look like. But clearly this is not working. So let me see. Do I have yes. Let's just open up a new VS Code window, actually. Development, examples, my app. Right, I was playing around with Vercel ones here, but essentially, I imagine Netlify is the same thing. So I have here. I don't know if you've probably seen this before. I'm going to run build again, but I don't really need to. npm run. This is what happens when you clone a basic template in solid npm run start. You've probably seen this before. And yeah, it's just this spinning thing, right? So essentially, to get, sorry, I'm closing my windows, to get this app to deploy to Netlify, I think all we need to do is run the Netlify CLI. Let's see what it says, right? First, make sure that we're logged in. Already logged in. Okay, so Netlify deploy. Let's see what it tries to do. Create and configure a new site. What are we going to call this? Vite starter. Publish directory. Might need to change this in the future, but let's give this a shot. I guess we could do start.dist, right? All right, let's see if our new site shows up on Netlify. Vite starter, manual deploy. And let's look at our deploy preview. Beautiful, and it worked. It is much easier, obviously, than what I'm making it look like, probably. But essentially, that's all we need to get started with Netlify. You can pretty much instantly with the CLI get your app up there. And if you go Netlify deploy prod, we'll do the prod deploy. What did I do wrong? Oh, this is weird. It's like it thinks I said deploy rod. That's so weird. Deploy prod. Unexpected argument rod. Oh, it's double. I'm just being dumb. And asking me this again. Okay, bam. And now we have BeatStarter Netlify app. That's crazy that I just got this because I feel like someone else should have BeatStarter.Netlify app. But there we go, deployed. Okay, and honestly, deploying for solid start apps like Hacker News is exactly the same thing. Let's swap our window here and go over here. Let's make sure this actually works, right? And it's like opening it in the wrong window. Sweet. Okay, never mind. Let's just try our Netlify preview thing. All right. All right, and here's our draft URL. Let's open it. And for some reason, it's like pulling me off to the wrong screen. Here we go. Here is our deployed Hacker News preview using Netlify. Okay, so this one doesn't have streaming, unfortunately, but it's interesting. You notice you don't see any load flicker. That's because it doesn't have streaming. So sometimes that can be a double-edged knife, so to speak, but I'd like to pretend you missed something important, but what actually happened was I tried to show everyone a Netlify starter, and that was pre-made for us, and it didn't work, and it keeps on crashing. So I had to just go take a sample, like one of our standard Beat templates, download it locally, and then do a Netlify deploy. And now I'm just showing solid start with Netlify. So, actually, no. Now that we're here, why don't we do something useful, right? Let's actually go in here and what version of Solid are we on here? This seems old. Let's upgrade Solid to 1.2.3 or something, and we're on like 10 of this. Let's just upgrade some dependencies. npm install, npm run build. And let's deploy our preview app. And let's look at it, make sure it looks nice. Again, wrong window. And yeah, looks good. Still works. We updated our deps. Let's just deploy this to production. Deploy prod. There we go. So we just updated the Hacker News example for Solid, and let's commit our changes back up. Beautiful. Okay, I don't know if anyone. Yeah, I talked about this briefly. Maybe if we have time, I'll go back to it. We probably will have time because I don't think the deployment stuff is going to take forever. Honestly, this is what I've been working on. And the funny thing is, although these have all different outputs, as I'm going to show you in a minute, the Hacker News examples or sorry, it's remarkably simple, similar the setups between setting up these different things. So let's move on to Vercel, right? I don't think there's anything more that I want to show on Netlify specifically. Now, Vercel is interesting, and I've had the pleasure of working on a brand new feature that they've been developing here. I've made a PR for it, and I'm kind of waiting for it to get merged. But essentially, Vercel has a couple ways of doing things, and one thing that's really cool that they do is that they have this ability for frameworks to kind of register themselves in this framework TS file, where you can basically set up things so that they can automatically detect it, and you set all your build commands, and there you go, it works. I set up solid for our normal templates, and I set up solid start this way, and they actually will host an example for you. So I under their examples, I've actually, sorry, not spelled, I have a solid example and a solid start example. And this is really quite cool because they kind of take that out of your hands. So if someone's like, oh, hey, I want to start a solid app or a solid start app, you have everything you need at your fingertips. You can just kind of browse the different configs. It shows up right in their UI, which I can show here. Let's go into Vercel. And I have a few apps here, but like if I was creating I'm just going to take this silly test project to show you what I'm talking about. But if I go to settings here, and I don't have anything secret in here, I don't think, but essentially, let's make this a little bigger. You can say what kind of project it is. Is it a Next project? Is it Blitz, DocuSort, Preact, Ember? And when I get this PR merge, solids and solid start is just going to show up as an option. So that's pretty cool. But the real cool thing that they're doing here is I showed that Hacker News example off, and it's kind of like a pinnacle. It's got streaming and it's on the edge and it does all that kind of cool stuff. But I had to use Next.js to do it. I kind of hacked around and I was like, saw what they're doing with Next and jammed it. But what Vercel's been working on is something they call the file system API. And it's really kind of cool because it has nothing to do with Next.js. It's still beta, but essentially you make an output folder in your project, and then depending on how you put the files in, kind of like how our routing solutions work, like they have pages and static and functions and middleware. Basically, depending on how you structure it, like, here's a blog site or here's this, it will do different stuff. Like you can have API routes, so you put API. It's basically like the advantages you have with Next without using Next, which makes it really thing. Middleware, this is how you get edge functions. You literally just put that in. So this is really easy for me because before I made a Vercel edge adapter, I thought I could have to make a different adapter for each kind of deployment because the builds and stuff are very different, and you'd have to kind of worry about that. But I realize now I can just make it configure, because there'd be different dependencies, like if I had to use Next.js or not use Next.js and all this stuff. But because it's just a simple file system output now, I can literally make a single Vercel adapter, and you can just go, I want on the edge or I don't want on the edge. And that's the direction we're going to be going with Vercel here. So far, I only support edge functions, but essentially, that's what we do here. So let's take a look. As I said, because our main example is like Vite, which isn't terribly interesting. Let me go back to my Vercel setup here, because I think, let's go overview. Let's see here. Yeah, here, I already did this earlier. I made this solid template that, does it actually work? Let's visit. No, maybe I deleted it. So let's hijack this for our own purposes here and use Vercel in our simple app setup here. So I'm not going to mess with this one. What I want, my app. We just made Netlify. Let's just make our thing work with Vercel now. Okay, it's basically the same deal. So this example is old. Solid 1.0 RC10. Anyway, doesn't really matter. CV template solid. Okay, so this one is nothing special. You see how Vite just has its normal assets? I'm just going to leave that as is. So if we want to, for our main solid templates, which are just Vite, it just recognizes Vite and it just uses just that as the dumps. So we can just go Vercel here, and let me make this a little bigger. And Vercel goes, oh, okay. In fact, it's already linked to this project. So it starts, it's just building and doing its thing already. And it's completed. Deploy. Let's open. And this is, again, wrong window. This is just our spinning globe here, working in preview. So this preview build, which we just did, should show up down here, and it's working. See, deployed by Ryan just now. But prod is broken, so let's update prod. I don't know why prod's broken, but I think it's just Vercel -- prod. And here we go again. Yeah, it takes a second to build because Vercel actually builds the project themselves. But as I said, when we get this all configured with the new solid integration that I'm currently have a PR for, this is going to be really nice. Yeah, so now production build is updated. Hopefully that looks better, doesn't it? Let's what's this, the actual site here? Solid template Vercel app, open. And there we are. We have our lovely Vercel spinning app. Okay, nothing too special there. But I want to talk a little bit more about the file API because the file API is really quite cool. So let's go. Let's look at solid start, and this time let's switch our branch over to the Vercel branch. I called it Vercel Edge, but it's not even Vercel Edge anymore. So let's look at solid start now. Not solid start. Let's look at the Hacker News example. My bad. And let's shrink that one down. Where is it? I want, that's Vercel. Don't need that one. So I got like too many VS Code windows open. Here we go. Hacker News example. Now we're on Vercel Edge. Okay, so let's npm install get our right dependencies. Let's blow out. Actually, you know what? While we're here, let's update solid too, right? It's been a while. And let's blow out our dist folder, and we don't need this Netlify folder. And all right. Now let's see here. Now let's run our Vercel command. So let's set up and deploy. Actually, no, before that, let's run our build command, npm run build. I want to show you what we generate here. And it's an output folder, and it generates a function manifest file, which is how Vercel finds your function. In this case, it's a middleware. This general Vite build that we've been seeing so far, the solid start build, goes in a static folder. And then the server folder has a pages middleware where our actual server render YAP goes. And this one, I'm going to just pull up here, is solid start Vercel is is a little bit different. They have this structure here. I don't know what it is exactly, but I guess they look for these keywords, and then you set a default for the middleware. So that part's a little bit weird and different. But generally speaking, the middleware gets your request, and then these request objects you're dealing, instead of being like an AWS event, are basically the browser's request and response objects, the native ones. There's a little bit fancy stuff here, but when I started using this right away, I'm like, oh, this is the same as Cloudflare. I haven't showed you Cloudflare yet, but essentially it was fairly obvious that they were using Cloudflare under the hood for their edge functions, because it's basically the very similar API. I had to do a little bit of fancy wrapping to tell it to kind of like serve the original file, you got to set these special headers. This is stuff they document. It took me a little bit of playing to get there, but essentially with this wrapper as my entry, I was very easily able to and get things going. And as I showed before, it's basically, if it's a post, send it to an action. This is how we do our isomorphic like RPC calls. If it's a URL, route, then we're going to do our render and send back the HTML. Otherwise, just forward the resource through. And this is basically there's a slightly different one for streaming and not streaming. For streaming, we actually create a transform stream and pass that through. But otherwise, it's basically the same wrapper. I haven't showed you this side of it, but almost all of these solid start adapters have the same format. I basically, if they have async, they all have async. So I have an async entry, and then I have a streaming entry if this platform supports it. There's an option you can set to your config to turn streaming on and off called prefer streaming. And I just kind of use that. And basically the adapters export a start and a build function. The start function is usually just like their developer preview. So this one just calls Vercel, the other one just calls Netlify, kind of like what we've been doing. But the build one actually is pretty similar for all of them. It uses the Vite programmatic API to build our outputs. So in this case, I'm building it to output static. And that's how I do all the client builds are handled by Vite. And even the server build is handled by Vite. But then after that, basically I do a bunch of moving stuff around, and then I use rollup to do the final server build to kind of stitch together the custom entries. Now, it might be possible with Vite to do this all on its own, but Vite likes its index HTML and some like weird quirks, and I was having issues with it. It was easier for me to just kind of pull rollup in to put together a server bundle. And here we're not like really caring that much. This is only on the build, and it just lets us stitch together these entry files that we use. So just using a few programmatic APIs. And if you look at the solid start adapters, they literally are all identical. All I do when I go in is go, slightly change the build output, but they're almost always the same. That's why I was able to kind of make new ones really, really quick. Most of the work is actually just figuring out what the entry format is, so that when we get our output, like here, I go all the way down to the bottom, we generate the right stuff. And in the case of Vercel edge functions, it's almost identical to Cloudflare. So I was able to almost immediately get that working. Probably more details than people care to know, but we now have this built, and just like before, let's just call Vercel on it. Yes. Yep. Existing project hacker news. Yes. And we're going to deploy with our new updated build, latest version of Solid, and takes a moment, and we're good. See, my hope, though, as I said, is when the integration works, you'll be able to just get this for free. Either take the examples directly off Vercel's page, and they have that similar deploy button like Netlify, so you'll just be able to go, I want this solid start demo. Just click deploy. They'll deploy it to you. You clone the Git repo, and you'll basically immediately have a working Vercel deploy. Or as I said, you can just do the adapter yourself, run the Vercel command, create the new app or whatnot, and let's just double check that this is working. Our Hacker News example is working. It is. Yeah, beautiful. So fast you don't even see the streaming. Oh, there you saw it, but yeah. And yeah, we're good to go. I'm gonna do a prod deploy of that one. But yeah, actually, it might be fun. Let's just it's probably not that fun for most people, but let's actually change one of the options here. We have adapter Vercel. Let's go. What if we go prefer streaming pulse, right? Not everyone wants to do streaming on their Vercel endpoint. I do default to prefer streaming. But okay, so first of all, let's double check that our production deploy worked properly. And this looks good. See the loading state as the data loads in from the stream. Okay, beautiful. And let's just go to one of these pages. Yeah, looks great. And let's actually just do it. Let's just do a preview build right now, not to prod, with streaming turned off. Kind of see how that works. I've kind of glazed over a lot of terms. Is everyone familiar with edge functions and whatnot, and the difference between serverless functions and edge functions? I realize I kind of just jumped right into it, and it might not actually be terribly obvious. Sorry, and I actually missed a question back a little bit. This file system API is specifically for handling off to Vercel for hosting, right? It's an API for deployment. Yes, the file system API is actually like if you can generate that format, Vercel knows what to do with it. So you can basically generate any type of app using kind of the same format. You can even combine static site, which will pull from their CDN, with like normal serverless functions and edge functions, all part of the same kind of app, and they'll just deploy everything as it makes sense based on how you format your files. It's super powerful. So yeah, so here let's see, if we just let's try our sample here with streaming off, and just to yeah, let's refresh. Oh no, maybe did not. Oh, did I not build? Huh. See, this is the thing right now. The way this is set up, the builds are happening on my computer. So even though I set the settings differently, I didn't actually build the project with the settings set differently. So there we go. Now let's run it again. Sorry about that. Let's take a second, and we already have this open. That's good. That means it deployed, or does that mean something's broken? No, it means it's deploying. Either that, or it means that I haven't tested the non-streaming version, and I have a bug in solid start. So we can actually see this super easily, because we can look at our latest deployment. It has a function, real time. There is a typo. I was positive I fixed this typo, but maybe I missed it in one location. So what happened here? I can fix this very quickly right now, but it looks like I have a typo in my generated stuff. So missing an O. I fixed this bug already, so I'm pretty sure I just installed an older version of a solid Vercel adapter, but okay, let's just fix that. But yeah, this is going to be a lot smoother, obviously, in the future. And I think that the amazing thing is how we have these tools, great UIs, interfaces to kind of intervene with, but in a lot of ways, they're all super similar. Yeah, there we go. And this one won't flicker. You won't see any you shouldn't see any loading state on this one, because it completely server renders before, and there's no streaming happening. Okay, cool. So that worked. I know, probably not the most interesting tangent, but yeah. Talk about the difference between Lambda functions and edge functions. Yeah, it's not the it's not actually a huge difference. It's all about where the function runs. Now, generally speaking, serverless functions are just little code executed functions, but they still get run on the typical VM infrastructure that you find on the cloud providers. You don't manage your own EC2 instances or whatever, but essentially they have a ton of computers running a ton of virtual environments. And what will generally happen is they'll allocate a certain amount of processing to run your functions, and you can actually set stuff because you get billed by like how much CPU you need or memory. And they'll kind of, if you've ever heard the term like startup or cold start, essentially when your function first fires, it will actually allocate some of that space to use. And if it runs again, it'll actually kind of keep it live. They don't actually kill the functions right away. They have them run and like be ready in the background. Maybe I forget the exact amount. It depends on the provider, maybe 20, 30 minutes. But essentially, that's kind of the gist of the functions. But if you get too many parallel requests, well, one function can't handle, so they allocate another, and you can kind of get into these chains of cold starts because a bunch of requests come in, and then essentially they all have to like the first one can't be fulfilled right away, so they try to allocate. The other one comes in, and they kind of spam out. It's possible to go kind of really wide. And I know this isn't specifically, but I just want to kind of explain a little bit about the basics of serverless functions. In any case, you get a certain allocation, and once you have enough parallel requests. And what's great about this is they can just scale up as needed. I mean, cold starts are awkward, so sometimes people ping their endpoints to make sure that like they always have at least one live or two live, a couple resources. Even on load times in case someone hasn't used the service for a while, and they can pick up really quickly. But generally, this is really great for smaller companies like startups and stuff because they don't know their allocation, and if their service, especially kind of sporadic, like maybe users only use it during the day or whatnot, it doesn't make sense to be running servers all the time. Generally speaking, if you run the servers yourself and you know the proper allocations, it is cheaper, and you can go in and do a bunch of other ways of things like run your own Kubernetes to kind of scale things up, and auto scaling groups in AWS and all that. But essentially, serverless functions are so easy. Like I've showed you, just deploy a function and you don't have to worry about that. What's the difference between edge functions? Well, they're just serverless functions with less resources allocated to them. And the reason is that instead of running in the like intranet of the company like AWS or whatnot, they run at what's called edge locations. And basically these edge locations are where like CDN hosting is. Basically, if you have assets, and if you ever use anything like Cloudflare or like for CDN or like CloudFront in AWS or whatnot, essentially when you have a site, you can have your assets distributed globally so that it's closer to users. So instead of going all the way back to AWS in East Virginia or whatever, essentially you can have a site in Australia where location in Australia, which will serve your static assets. What edge functions do is they let you run functions basically at those locations. And there's usually some restrictions to them because like essentially you're not, even though they have like a really good connection to the main service like at AWS, like it's better than the person's own internet thing. Like this is dedicated between these edge locations and the main data warehouses and whatnot in AWS. It's not the same as actually being in there. So quite often there's limited functionality and you have less memory to work with. But what's really cool is it gives you a way of intercepting requests and running code even before the CDN. A lot of times with edge functions, what they do is they actually intercept requests before they get to the CDN. So you can do really cool things like edge slicing, where you can kind of like go, oh, I actually want to mess with stuff. Like I want to change the request. You can do auth up there too if you want. And you can both kind of on the way in change the request, or on the way out mess with it, right? So you might go, okay, I'm going to go get this asset, get it from the CDN, and then on the way out, intercept it and be like, I'm going to personalize it for someone slightly. And that's been kind of all the rage recently with static sites, because you can basically put static sites in the CDN and then tweak them a bit right on the edge. But we can do more with that, right? And that's what I've been playing with. If you got a small framework, something easy to render, you could just do the full rendering at the edge. Sometimes, obviously, there's latency issues with like database connections, or you can't get private thing. You have to kind of go over the internet in some cases. Like if you've ever dealt with what are they called in AWS? There's like zones essentially, and stuff like edge functions live outside of those zones. Other global services like S3 or DynamoDB also live outside their design, but like you generally, for a lot of cloud providers, you have your own kind of VPC, or like virtual private network, which kind of mirrors the old standard way you'd like set up this kind of stuff in the hardware level. They kind of brought that over, and cloud providers like AWS and Azure kind of mirror that. And this is great for people familiar with, classic networking stuff. But essentially, with edge functions and functions, you kind of mostly bypass that stuff if you choose what kind of services you use. Globally available APIs, things like, I said, DynamoDB on, or just like API type services, you can just access them from the edge. And even if there's latency, this is why I'm so excited about streaming on the edge, because here's the thing. It's super close to the end user. So serving static content happens fast, which means if you have a page, you can get that shell up there. You can get the main content to them almost immediately, as if it was static. But if the connection to the data source is further away, takes longer, it's okay with streaming. You don't lose that benefit of getting it in their hands right away. Whereas if you're doing async rendering and there's more database latency, well, you just gave up the benefit of being so close to the end user, because you have to wait for that data anyways to actually send them the page. So that's kind of the whole deal with Edge, and why Edge is so exciting is because it puts the processing almost right in the customer's hands, right? It's right where there's the CDN caches are. And this is super powerful stuff. I don't know if that's a great explanation, but I hopefully that makes sense to some people. I've obviously dabbled in this stuff more than just with the stuff I'm doing here with Solid, but it's when I see things with edge streaming, I'm like, that's where you need to be. And that's why I got so excited by Cloudflare, which was my original adapter. But Vercel is doing the same thing. So that's kind of the gist. I don't know if that answers the question, but hopefully that gives a little bit of insight. So let's kind of, I think that is mostly on Vercel. And honestly, I'm going to go with Cloudflare a little bit faster here, because it's more of the same. I think the thing you probably take away from this stream more than anything is, even though I've been doing a bunch of work trying to get these kind of custom builds and adapters, and as I said, I'm very impressed with what Vercel is doing here. Essentially, they're all kind of the same. And just to briefly show what that means, I can go back to the Cloudflare example, which is probably the oldest of the bunch. Actually, you know what? Let's commit our changes for this one, because we did update the depths, right? Update. Let's not keep our prefer streaming off, because we want streaming. Update depths. Okay. Not really. It's just size. Like, for example, on AWS, your standard Lambda function can be like 128 megabytes or something, or yeah. And the edge, like the ones that are actually on the edge, like it's funny, AWS actually has 4 classifications of edge functions. They let you actually intercept request in, like pre-CDN, post-CDN, like on the way to S3 or internal network, back from S3 or wherever, and then finally back out again. So they actually have, and the ones on the inside are actually the same as normal Lambda functions. It's only ones like that are pre-CDN that are actually on the edge. Sorry, probably not important detail, but essentially, I think those you can only have like 1 megabyte. So it does affect things, but so size is a consideration. And then I mentioned it also matters on a lot of cloud provider services. Now, with something like Vercel or Cloudflare or Netlify, when they get to edge functions, I'm sure it's on the docket. essentially, they don't have those other services anyways. That's not what they're focused on, right? They expect you to use APIs, Jamstack, all that kind of stuff. So generally speaking, as long as you aren't producing like huge megabytes of code, you're fine. And I think they actually have. I think Vercel and Cloudflare probably have slightly different limits. I know maybe AWS has expanded theirs since then, but because sometimes having binaries for like Postgres and stuff is where you actually need C code actually took more space on the edge functions, and we actually had to do a little wrangling on our bundling to actually make sure we hit under that limit. So things have probably changed slightly. It's been a couple years now, I guess, about a year and a half since I've been at eBay, but since I've been wrangling it. But generally, it's mostly about code size and memory allocation. But the code itself is fine. So where was yes, committed our changes, and yeah, we're good. Let's quickly go back to this one. This is the original Cloudflare one. The only thing you're going to notice with Cloudflare is it was the first one, and it's also maybe the easiest one. Was the easiest one for me because I don't think I actually needed to change. Yeah, I just left everything originally where it was, and Cloudflare just needed to know where the entry point was. So I'm just like dist index, fine. And the Cloudflare example, if we get down to the bottom here, is actually, it's a little bit different than the one we just looked at from Vercel, but it's actually really similar. For the streaming, it's create that transform stream exactly the same way, pass it to render, and send back the new response. These things are almost identical, and the process for building them is almost identical. And it's nice to be able to kind of hide or abstract that piece from the end user. So I'm not going to deploy this one, but essentially you just call Wrangler, and it's the same thing. Wrangler deploy prod. These services are all very similar, and they're actually all really quite nice. Cloudflare is a little different than the others because you don't. Essentially, I mean, it's not really. They have the edge functions. I don't know if they have the static deploy things. They're set up a little bit differently. They have Cloudflare workers, which are the edge functions, and they have Cloudflare sites, I think it's called, which are where you can have like the static hosted stuff. And in our case for Cloudflare, actually, we kind of get a combo of both, and we use something called a KV store to access the resources. These things are really all quite equivalent. This is kind of why I think these adapters and stuff like Solid Start should exist, so that we can essentially wrap the functionality very easily. You don't have to worry about this bit. I know I'm kind of going into it and showing a little bit of how it works and how the build step works, but I mean, really, this is all we need. And it's really cool that we can just share the same setup and just do slightly different builds, and they all are roughly the same thing. Yeah. All right. So, I mean, that's honestly most of the stuff with deployment. I knew today I wouldn't really have as much stuff. And honestly, I don't think people found it as interesting as some of the other streams. This is kind of common knowledge you can find. But it's really cool to see what Vercel's been doing with edge functions. It's really cool to see not just with edge functions, but with their file-based API. And it's kind of cool to see this kind of converging. I think we're seeing a move more towards using request response, like built-in browser native things for handling these things, which is quite cool. Remix Run runs that way as well. So seeing that in our deployments is good. And honestly, taking the same app and switching where you want to go is really quite easy. Doesn't really take much thought, and that really was my goal in terms of that. Since we're probably going to end a little early today because I don't have a ton of topics. Who wants to? I'm just going to go at it. Let's look at this Twitter conversation that people said was kind of interesting that I glazed over earlier. I'm just going to look at my notifications. I can probably find it there. Yeah, let's get to the top of it. Here we go. Where is this thing? Not being able to conditionally run hooks in React is such a pain. I know there's a good reason and there are workarounds, but I just want to use it in if statement and have it work. I I honestly, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think this is that big of a deal, but people did kind of get to it. Some people called out solid, which is cool, and you know I appreciate that. But honestly, even if you can do it in solid, this isn't really that big of a like. It's just a weird situation. But what kind of caused the conversation? Let me see if I can pull it up here. Is someone was like, "Oh, this is why I love Svelte. Svelte doesn't have to worry about any of this stuff." Blah blah blah. And yeah, here we go. The lack of hook rules, is such a fresh breath of air. And when I started using Svelte, it's so liberating to not have to work in the confines of hooks and also the virtual DOM. I know that doesn't help, but I just want to share. Sweet, and that is awesome. As I mentioned, a lot of people are really kind of embracing and feeling the benefits of reactivity because of this. And oh, it's so simple. Where's the catch? So what I was going to point out was this very example about being conditional actually applies to Svelte as well, because you can't put a dollar sign label inside an if statement, nor can you nest dollar sign labels. I actually tested. I already knew you couldn't, but I wanted to test it. And the reason is Svelte, like React, runs off components. So essentially, regardless of the reactivity model, you still kind of rerun full components. Maybe not all the parts of the components, but you rerun the whole cycle from top to bottom. And for that reason, you don't get to be dynamic with the fixed points of the template. And since Svelte can't nest, you can't put like a HTML tag inside a dollar sign expression or whatever. You have to break it down to a different component anyways. Essentially, it has exactly the same restrictions as React. So I wanted to point that out. And I guess Ember is the same. Someone's mentioning, but essentially, in response to this, we got the attention of Sebastian. I don't know his last name. I don't know if I pronounced it right. And he is some people were like, "Oh, well, what's this guy saying? Who's this guy?" It's like, always be careful to look up who you're talking about before you kind of go on a side thing. Seb is basically the visionary between React. He's not the original creator, but he's been kind of in charge of the vision. Everyone else on the React core team kind of defers to his where he sees things going. I noticed this talking to Dom, talking to Dan. For his real name is React. Yeah, he is basically like he is the guy, the brains behind the whole thing. Suspense, concurrent mode, algebraic effects, whatever. This is. Sorry, did I share this one properly or did I click the wrong one? He is basically. It's important to take that to understanding here, because he does not often come out to actually. He kind of like works in where his vision is, kind of keeps his head focused. It's very rare that we actually engage with him in this sort of way. So I thought this was actually quite interesting. And what he's saying is my main gripe with Solid and Svelte approach is that, and evident by this thread, is it's very easy to just have it work for conditions in initial mount, but not react to changes. It's simple but deceptive. Doesn't matter it doesn't matter for a few consumers, maybe. And obviously, my first thought was maybe I don't think we should be bunching Solid and Svelte together. I mean, he probably doesn't know very much about Solid, but essentially, Solid is fine-grained reactivity, doesn't really have components. Svelte is component like React. So when it runs once, it does have that concern for him, right? If Svelte does run once, um, you can't change the structure of a component, um, because you can't nest reactivity. Like you can always make another abstraction, right? You can always wrap a decision in another reactive point. Um, Technically speaking, you can do that with Svelte, but by breaking components and using like conditionals, and that's ultimately how I approach this with Seb. But let's go a little further. Alexis, who's a kind of he made the solid labels and headless UI. He's pretty outspoken member of our community. Was like, wait a second, no, it's that this is a misconception about solid. You know, like the components render once, but everything else is independent listens and updates reactive changes. To be fair, Svelte is the same on this line, so this doesn't completely kind of divert him. The concept that is shared, with Vue and similar stuff, right? Vue is actually more like solid because Vue can actually nest reactivity if you handle the cleanup yourself. But again, I think this doesn't really answer the question for Seb. He says, yeah, and Svelte is the same, essentially using equivalent to hooks, which is fine. But in my mind, you shouldn't have access to props in those code paths except as input to initial state. It's too easy to use initial stale props. Otherwise, I love the simplicity of it, right? And I think the misconception here comes a bit again because not realizing you can reactively structurally change things, right? So, Alexis, I'm not sure I understand. Any particular reason why they shouldn't have access? I'm sure the argument is as valid for mounting two components conditionally, or maybe I'm wrong. And he's saying anything you read from prop string setup won't be reevaluated, so a consumer can't reconfigure on the fly. It's no longer declarative. You could avoid this problem by making it a generic setup function that doesn't accept any particular props. And which comes down to, what if the props are reactive? And that would work, right? As long as you can't easily get the current value, because if you read the current value, the setup function, you're back to square one. And there's a little bit of an exchange here. And honestly, I think there's a miscommunication here because we're like, what are you talking about? Why would you need to rerun the setup function? You have to do something to respond to the new prop. In that case, they deal with it in two places, mount and update, but you have to know that. Yeah. So this is, I think, is part of where that misconception is, because from the Svelte view, where the whole thing's a component or that setup function, you have these two code paths and you have to basically handle the update and the creation differently. But when solid, using primitives, you don't. It's actually the same hook. Yeah, it's because Vue was brought into the conversation earlier, and that was my whole problem here, right? Because here's my response to this. I was like, where is it? Is it here? I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't really think of things in setup functions and components. I have a nested reactive graph where the closest things to the change update, things are reactive tracking or they aren't. You always read the latest values. Yeah, so this is probably a little bit hard for people following to kind of follow, because they're like, what is he talking about? Setup function? Solid doesn't have a setup function. I think this is still coming from a view or a Svelte mindset where it's a component. Do you know what I mean? Like you still have that code that runs once for the component, and if you want to run code that doesn't run once, you have a separate path, and you need to handle both the initial state and the change state. Where given Solid's granularity, we actually don't have that limitation. We do get combined stuff together the same way React does. And I don't think this was very clear to him. And I honestly don't think it was clear to him by the end of the conversation. But he never actually interacted with me directly. He seemed to just be fine talking to Alexis, which I guess is good, because Alexis did a very good job of articulating this anyways. But essentially, he presented this problem. And I think this is kind of a cool problem. Out of curiosity, how would you express this case conditionally in Solid or Svelte if anyone is lurking? Yes, because exactly, because it's reactive. Like, why would you have a stale prop? I think he's trying to get to this example essentially, and actually think about how you would do this in Vue, Dan. I think this is actually valuable. he's saying pretend you have some kind of hook or reactive value or something that makes you decide whether you're going to have the videos. And if there's no videos, return no videos. But in the case that there aren't any videos, I want to kind of grab from a different hook or a different data and, or sorry, in the case there are videos, I also want to grab this other information and kind of throw it in with the videos. And in React, I think this actually might even work. Maybe I'm not sure if early returns on hooks actually work, because as long as like they're in sequence, it's, I don't know if it's okay for the counts to match. I should have clarified, but essentially this is actually not particularly obvious or easy solution to solve in Solid, because in the simple case, yes, if videos never changes, and think about this for Vue as well. If videos never changes, you could just basically write this sort of logic, right? At least in Solid, setup function for Vue being separate is a little bit more awkward, but assuming that you can, because the whole point is, I want to send this back without hitting the second hook. That's the argument here, basically. Like, do this, only do the first hook, not the second. When you have a declarative thing, it's hard to have kind of this then that when your approach is very declarative. And obviously a setup function which runs once needs to basically grab from both of these hooks ahead of time, essentially. And even Solid is a little bit like that. The answer is obviously split off to another component, but if we're going to avoid splitting into another component, what can we do here? And the first answer Alexis proposed was actually, yeah, the idiom. Yeah, exactly. And sorry, I spread that too fast. This is true in every framework. I think the answer in every framework is make another component. This is just weird scenario, right? The interesting thing is fine-grained reactive reactivity that goes down to the binding doesn't have problems with this. Like, how should I put it? In Solid, we can nest it. And I'm going to show my answer before getting into it. But I said we should just do this, which was use videos, and then when videos, or when there's not videos, show the fallback and no videos. But when there is videos, now just run this hook in here and return videos. Like, this is actually pretty easy to do with Solid. I'm sorry, I'm blocking the screen here. Like, this isn't React code. And someone's like, well, use ternararies, but then I would have had to use an IFE or like a self-executing function around here just to get it to run. But my point is, this is how you would do it in Solid. You basically nest it. You have one condition, and if that, and we can use hooks right in the middle of things, right? Technically, this is the use a different component solution, but in Solid, you don't have to bring it to a different component. And I think it's kind of funny mentioning this, is because if this was Marco, this would even be easier because everything's tagged. So it would literally just compress up into something that would look almost completely natural. This is one of the powers I was talking about Marco with co-location, is stuff like this looks just like normal templating. It wouldn't even have this awkward, like, oh, now we're breaking to JavaScript. It would literally just look like a template, and you can just do this without thinking. But the power of fine grain is that it's this declarative structure, right? Where the React code has this early exit, it's very imperative. It makes sense for it. And my whole argument there was like, which I replied here, was that sure, you can come up with a situation like this, and I can solve it like this, and maybe that looks a little bit awkward, but I could also just do the opposite. I'd like, Solid's really good at nesting. React is bad at nesting. It's good at things that are serial. So I could come up with a nested hooks example. And would you do that with React? It'd be impossible or very difficult, right? Like, it isn't hard to, if we give an example that's nested, it caters to Solid. If we give an example that's like serial like that, it caters to React. But what ends up happening with this conversation is Alexis basically goes, well, if video static, which I mentioned before, then this is valid code. But if it's not, I'm just going to wrap the second half of that in a create memo. And he's right. Yes, sorry. And this is the problem with the example, and I was actually going to get to it in a second. He's treating it like it's a reactive tracking, but in reality, what would happen is that hook would be used where it's used. So either it's a hook grabbing some data that's used on the video tag, which means that whole outer context doesn't matter because it'll be used in the video tag, or if it needed to track, you would just call the function inside the video tag with solid. Like he basically is going like, oh, you have to be careful not to read anything else in case to create memo and have it recreate everything again. But the truth of the matter is, because of nesting in solid, that actually isn't that big of a problem, right? I use show because I know naturally that it's inert inside the show function hook. But the truth of the matter is, even Alexa's sort of naive approach, if we were actually using it where it was used, this problem goes away, right? Like this thinking that he has here, he's right, but Solid's designed to avoid this problem. Every piece of it where things are inert, the whole idea of accessing things as late as possible means that you actually don't have to worry about this. And as I said, if Seb actually addressed me directly, I would have explained it to him, but he never actually responded to anything I said. So, it's fine. He said, I agree, but there's a lot of workarounds. And he mentions at the end here that Svelte could do the same trick nesting $signs, but they can't, which was the whole point of this whole thing. Svelte is actually is remarkably more like React than people realize. Exactly. Like, don't get me wrong. This is why I made components inert. I was scared of this sort of nesting and accidental triggering. But the thing is, before I made components inert, 90% of the time, people never hit this problem. It was only people who had bugs, like people who were destructuring, that hit this problem. Like in natural usage, Solid doesn't over execute. I think it's hard for people coming from a component granularity to realize that if you just do everything where it's used, you automatically avoid the risk of re-execution because things are already so granular. Like you don't accidentally, like, as you say, be careful not to subscribe to something else. You wouldn't actually write it there. You would write it where you subscribe to it. Like this is going to be one of those challenges, I think, for people coming in, because like from the React mentality, because they're used to just accessing variables where they want. But once you start doing things the solid way, like in that thinking, you don't hit this. And that's what I'm trying to say. Being aware of this solid pushing into patterns and certain safeguards built in to avoid accidental triggering. It doesn't mean people occasionally are like, why isn't this something updating? But it can be tracked really easily. Basically, if someone accidentally destructures something, like people come in and go, why have I lost reactivity? They never share the right code in the Discord, which is unfortunate because they don't think that way. They always go, they look at the setter and they're like, I'm setting this. Why is this not updating? I'm like, where are you using it? And almost immediately, I can eyeball it without even running the code because someone destructured something or accessed it in the wrong place. You can almost always tell just from line of sight on this kind of stuff. When things over execute, that's harder. That's when you need the debugger and you're like, why are these things executing? But losses of reactivity are actually usually relatively easy, much easier to track. And that's why I set up Solid this way, where very careful not to over execute. And the patterns built in actually lend to this. So as I said, I didn't get a chance to directly interact. I responded to Seb, but he never responded to me. He never engaged me, so I wasn't able to really explain this, which is too bad. As I said, I've always had a really good repertoire, like what's the term, whatever, like conversation with Dan, but my interactions with Seb haven't really gone that great. Yeah, and I mean, that sounds kind of idiomatic and maybe forced, because people made fun of Seb a little bit, which is unfair. When have you ever seen React as becoming a black box? It's see, a lot of people level insults against hooks, and they're in that thread that I feel aren't fair. and I always defend it. But this interaction is kind of the person they're joking sort of, but this React core team member they're talking about is Seb, pretty much. Cool, check out this cool thing I did with hooks. Yeah, this is the format guy. That will break for the following incredibly subtle reasons. Oh, you're right. Honestly, this is more intuitive in classes. Don't worry, it'll make sense. You just need to completely reconfigure your brain. That's sort of the joke here. And to be fair, I think this is fine. And this is actually from one of Rich Harris's talks. I said I love Rich Harris's talks. But essentially, solid or reactivity kind of pushes you that way too. People don't realize this because I say there are these little gotchas in every framework, every approach. People don't see them as felt. So like it makes me come off as a bad guy sometimes because when like I don't like the spread of misinformation. So when someone's like, and for some reason, a lot of like that's where I hear a lot. Sometimes people say crap about Solid, and I'm like, no, don't think we're exempt from this stuff. But it happens a lot with Svelte too. And the truth of the matter is, you do have to be aware of this to a certain degree. Like you do have to think this way. As much as things are easier or automatic, there is a sense that things are different. And but the thing is, just because they're different doesn't mean they're bad. You just have to like embrace the patterns. Hooks are different. These are the patterns. Now that we've lived with hooks for a while, we have an idea of what the hook rules are, and people are still whining about it, but that's where it is. I'm sure if Solid ever got that popular, people would be whining about stuff about us too, but it would just be different stuff. And the key thing, though, I want to point out is that like React, where there's this happy path with hooks, there is a happy path with reactivity, and these kind of concerns that Seb's worried about are just not things. Like they're just not concerns in the same in that sort of way, because the patterns actually lend to it, right? This is certainly true of the control flow. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what point you're making, but yes, the control flow are examples of things that I've built just to kind of help kind of push things along so that people don't have to worry about some of those details. But as I said, biggest ones are simply from the fact that components are inert and that tracking is granular. Like even as I said, even if you just naively wrapped everything in create memo, if he actually showed where that some other prop was being used, the naive Solid approach would not over execute. I just use show because I'm just being safe, but the simple example would actually work too. Yes, and yes, we aren't React. Yes, yeah, exactly. Control flow is a perfect example of why we're not React. And yeah, the funny thing is, we're also not Svelte or Vue. We don't have this built in the template. These are actually handwritten runtime mechanisms that anyone could run. And let's be fair, most people aren't going to write their own for loop. I mean, I did have the reason to the other day, and maybe that means it should have been core, but I was working on one of ththose 3D demos, and I said the other day, I mean like a few months back, and I realized I wanted a repeat control flow, one where you would take a number and it would do the same thing 5 times or 6 times, and it would scale. So if you went from 5 and then you tweaked it to 10, it would only create the 5 next ones. Our built-in control flows aren't like optimized for that case. So I just wrote one by hand. It was a lot simpler than our for loop one, and presto, it worked. Obviously, people aren't going to generally do that, but that is kind of the power here. And I think it's interesting because essentially, because of the way reactivity has been marketed, and because of the way people kind of look at React frameworks like Vue or Svelte, people look at Solid and they're like, okay, it's React like that, no beach DOM. It just must not be flexible or have that just JavaScript. It's funny, Solid values that aspect of React so much that it is, even though like the mechanisms are so different, it is so similar to React in that aspect of just being able to just have runtime JavaScript doing the thing and you being in complete control. React developers like thrive in that, and the design likes that. Solid has those same things. I know this is the one point where most people, we've had incredible support from the React community, especially compared to some of the other reactive communities, which are kind of like, oh, they see Solid as kind of like aggressively attacking their positioning because I devalue a lot of the stuff they devalue. But the React community has generally been like, oh, Solid actually looks like a reactive library I'd use. But in their head, they're like, yeah, no, maybe not. Like, because the thinking is like, well, it's still just a reactive library. I like my JavaScript. I like my non-magic. When they realize that Solid is also non-magic and has scheduling and can do concurrent rendering and have the same capabilities, suddenly, you know, maybe it's not as friendly anymore because it, like things aren't that different. It's always easy to kind of go like, oh, it's different. So, it's not a threat or it's not like the same thing. But as I said, Solid values React's principles so much that it has a lot of those same characteristics. Um, like, sure, we're not using .map here. We do have to be conscious of memoization of control flow, but like when you think about how adaptable this is, how you can just kind of take up the pieces and move it around, it actually in some ways exemplifies that even more than React because you can just get away from the virtual DOM, get away from this component model. You can just go, oh, I just want this one thing to update. You can kind of do whatever. And that's weird because when these kind of examples go and people go, oh, well, how would you do that in Solid? Well, I've never had a problem doing so. There's usually like the easier way, like I posted, or the more complex way, which kind of goes into it. But reactivity is just a way of modeling things. So it, that's the difference, right? Like because it's just these building blocks and model things, you can literally use reactivity to solve any problem. So like when someone's like, "Oh, can your framework do this?" The answer is always yes. It's like it's never a question. And I think that's kind of crazy because that isn't true of reactive frameworks. Most reactive frameworks, like that are really structured around the templating, and it's the templating that does the thing. Like the compiler, like the way Svelte works, and it's not true of VDOM libraries because like the VDOM is the thing. You don't get to escape the VDOM. That's the change mechanism. So like you can do what the VDOM can do, and don't get me wrong, the VDOM can do a ton, but the thing it can't do is not be a VDOM. Whereas a reactive system can be a VDOM if it feels like it. Like there's just no limit here. And in some ways, maybe that's because it's too simple. Do you know what I mean? Like people complain about Redux, and you can do kind of almost anything with Redux. I mean, it's not always efficient, but it's so simple. It's just like previous state, next state, some kind of modifier. Like you can add a bunch of middleware on top, Redux Saga or Redux Observable, and you're just like, why? Or you just use thunks, and you can do all this stuff. And that's kind of the problem that comes with being too simple, because sometimes you miss the gap on a key edge case. In this case, async is a real thing. You know what I mean? Redux Toolkit is taking care of that largely, but you understand if you build a system that's too simple that doesn't consider like a fundamental important thing, like let's say async is a real thing, then even though it's simple, which means it can do anything, it you still have work to do and lots of boilerplate where it isn't adaptable as easily into what you said. I'm not. The reason I'm less big on usually flexible things with lots of config, is that it makes a bunch of assumptions. Sure, it kind of guides you through the common cases, but you've already built too much with it. If you start with small composable pieces, then you can build whatever you want with them. The key is make them small and adaptable, make them do exactly what they're supposed to do. Sure, again, if the things you're building are too complicated, then yes, that's a lot of boilerplate. But if you make them reusable and composable, you or someone only has to do that work once. Yeah, I love React because it allows me to write beautiful declarative code quickly, and it's super easy to update state. However, once you write, yeah, and The thing is, I've been trying to straddle this line because I'm talking here waxing poetically about reactivity. And the thing is, reactivity is so powerful that it can be anything to anyone, right? It's funny. I always complain that frameworks shouldn't try to be anything to everyone. I believe in that because the higher you get up on the abstraction level, like then you have to make choices, you have to have opinions. I don't think your opinion should be please everyone. Otherwise, you just make a mess. But on the low level, adaptable things can be. So what I've tried to do is guide things on a very specific direction. I think React has the right philosophies. So let's take our universal can do anything and make something that feels like React. That's the thing. I'm hoping that on the basic experience level, when people use Solid, they do feel a bit like React. I know people would like it to feel a bit like Svelte, but it's my happy place would be somewhere in the middle where you're like, oh, this is like React. It's explicit. I understand what I'm dealing with. Here's some state. I can just update it. And then, it just works. But then, kind of meet in the middle ground, like Svelte, where it's like, oh no, there's no use ref or use callback or weirdness. You just kind of continue on that thing. That's my hope. I don't know if that's truly achievable, but then it goes beyond that for me because that's stage level 0 and level 1. I want the person who picks up these tools to go like, I can make 3G, I can make React 3 or whatever. Like the funny thing is I did make a custom renderer, but even before that, someone can just go pick up these reactive primitives and make 3D themselves. Loom Element, which is done with web components, but it didn't need to be done with web components per se, already is a full 3D renderer setup using Solid without me introducing custom renderers. Like custom renderers is nice because it works with some existing APIs people have, some kind of mentality people have. But if you are versed with reactivity, if you understand create signal, create memo, and create effect, you can literally build anything. And sure, as I said, it might be more work, but that's where the scale is. That you start with a simple experience, you scale to what you need, and it's composable. So Joe Pia, who knows 3D, made something for you. You don't have to remake it. It's the whole idea behind components. As long as you can compose, the sky is the limits because you don't have to force that complexity onto other people. And that is what React has taught us. And I don't know if every framework has picked up the message. A lot have. That's why people are into hooks. People are into components. Components are composable, but hooks take that further because of these behaviors. And I said reactivity has been doing a lot longer than React hooks, but it's just Dan Abramoff was going off a little while ago about composition being king or never bet against composition. And like, yes, don't bet against composition. It's been a key part of all my API designs and the framework work I've been doing because of just how powerful it is. Sure, you're not going to appreciate it at first. You don't need it to go use state and update a counter or whatever. But once you get beyond that level, once you want to do powerful things, this is where it comes in. And hooks have that characteristic. I think in Svelte, the closest thing you have are the actions. People are really excited about the use, but you can't apply those to components. And this is the same kind of problem with a lot of custom directives and Vue and stuff. To be fair, Vue uses fine-grained reactivity like Solid, but this is why they went with the composition API, and this is why they went with the whole ref sugar and stuff, because they knew that they wanted that composition. That's how you grow. I think I'm going to be really interested to see where Svelte goes in the future because they don't have that characteristic that I consider fundamental to building a well-designed framework. And the problem is, it's not the thing the beginner is going to thank you for. The beginner is going to go like, you just let me use let. They don't realize that they didn't let you use let local storage. And now, don't get me wrong, there's stores and other stuff, but and you can do this other way, and that's how you level up progressively. But what's more powerful is if it was just the same thing the whole time, not like level 0, level 1, now use observables. What if it was just a completely transit experience? And honestly, this is why I love React, because you learn use state, you learn use memo, you learn, like they have a few extras that I don't need, but you learn those hooks and you are done. Like, yes, there's complicated interactions, you learn best practices, but you are done. That is the end of the things. They put it on the table. They go, like, learn these 10 things and just master learning how to use those well. The thing is, in React, I don't have to go back to once I've got to intermediate mastery level, can it go higher? I don't need to go back to the docs. I just know how these things work. Small API surface, and I can intuitively know. I know, okay, I've got these 6 tools at my disposal. Maybe I haven't figured out the right pattern, but like I intuitively know what they do, and I can put them together, and maybe I'll use a third-party package to cover the gaps. When you have these level up progressive framework type mentalities, yes, the beginner comes in and it's like, yes, I didn't have to learn anything. But the person who's advanced has to now remember every freaking step of the way. And I just, at a certain point, that doesn't scale. Like all the different shortcuts hands, all the different things, because they can come across all those different variations. And I mean, maybe that's my big spiel here for Solid, and it's a big spiel for React. But I think these are the characteristics that are actually important for this kind of design considerations. And I'd love to, hear maybe members of the React core team talk about, because my feeling is they value the same things, right? And this is maybe this is the division. Maybe this is the difference here between some of the frameworks. What do we got? Some comments here. Where is it here? I've always viewed Svelte as ideal for building interactive documents. In that case, the beginner will thank you for those features. Remember. Yeah, okay. Yeah, exactly. Because how many different ways can you declare something in Vue? And this is part of being everything for everyone and being a progressive framework. It's so weird because if you want adoption, you go easy and you let people grow. People see Solid and they're like, oh, it's an expert framework. And I know Dan's doing a lot of work to kind of make it easier and get to people. And maybe they're right. Is React an expert framework? Maybe. This is why you got to work on the docs and stuff. The problem is, once you get past level 1, 2, like get past that very beginner stage, you just accelerate. The potential opens wide. And I feel like this is why React is staying and why React's here. When React first came out, I was like, man, this will just pass. It wasn't because I didn't like JSX. I just actually hated class life cycles. But I figured that at a certain point, there'd be the next thing, right? And the reason people stayed with React wasn't the reason why they liked React initially. You got to understand, like when Svelte and new frameworks come out and there's like hype, there's like the things that get people immediately, and then and those are very different from the things that have people stay with the framework. And Svelte was a perfect example because they kind of came in on the performance track and stuff, kind of the same avenue we're going with Solid. But people came in, people kind of have stuck with it because of, what they feel like, just how nice or easy these things are, and where they don't have to think about it. The thing is, I want to see the next step, because there's always that honeymoon period. If you've ever seen that graph where people like talk about levels of mastery, where you kind of like first think it's so hard and then or over the moon and then come down. It's a meme. I probably could look it up if I wanted to, but like, what is it, like stages of becoming, of learning, becoming a doctor. That's what I probably won't be able to find it. It's like a joke meme where they show people like depressed, and then I'm not going to find it on here. I'd have better luck looking through Twitter, and I don't feel like doing that right now. But essentially, I want, when we get to the place where we have, the real heavier problems, then we can kind of see whether it sticks. And to be fair, Rich Harris Stevens kind of said this himself. Like he built Svelte as like the best demo framework, in a sense. Like it was really good at putting together stuff for the Guardian or the New York Times. And don't get me wrong, I think it scales to real apps. I think it scales easier to stuff like basic websites because of just how simple it is. But he built it for that purpose. That's why there's stuff like the stores are the way they are. They don't have nesting, they don't have proxies or any of that kind of stuff. I looked at that and go, like, how can you have big data sets without granular nesting? There's a limit to how many like separate stores you can have. I wrote an article about, applying React mentality to Svelte to become a better Svelte developer, kind of understand the gaps. And this is sort of where the root of that kind of thinking came from. And I think that when you kind of step back from all that and you look at what React's done well, it was never about the things that people originally found or looked for. You know what? Dan Abry, I love Dan Abramoff's writing. He had a article like way early days. I don't even think he was on the React team at the time. And yeah, that's a classic. You might not need Redux, but he started talking about it, and he just never finished the article or finished the thought. And let's see if I can find this article. You're missing the point of React. January 22nd, 2015. Do you think this is still relevant today? I wouldn't be surprised if it was. I've seen React misunderstood by smart people more often than any other JavaScript library. React is packed with ideas that were radical at the time of introduction. This created an error controversy that hasn't quite resolved. He says that after years of using React, observing people learning, I can say that the best parts of React are not the ones that made it famous. They're not the virtual DOM. They're not the custom event system, server rendering, or JSX. They're rather a few boring and powerful ideas. And he kind of goes on a bit about, I mean, I think this article is worth a read, but he to be continues it. This is such a short article, but like I wasn't going to read the whole thing on stream, but seriously, using other people's code is like surfing. You control and surrender. You've got to trust the wave to carry you. Stop paying attention. The first abstraction leak will throw you under the water. When we see something that is new, both technologically and philosophically, we tend to focus on the technology part because we need to aim the magic first. We've had enough black boxes in our careers. We want to understand. It's not the full picture, but at least up to the level where we can make snarky comments that are also correct to some degree. How is more viral than why at this point? Yeah, I probably should. You know what? Yeah, let me copy this in the chat so everyone can get access to it here. In case you're following along. I'm sorry, this is completely off topic. Deployment wasn't as interesting as actually talking about this sort of thing, but like when React came out, Virtual DOM got everyone talking. It was a breakthrough, and like any good piece of engineering, is built with careful, considered trade-offs. The concept was so simple and powerful at the time that became the way people introduced and differentiate React from other front-end frameworks. React is a view layer that uses Virtual DOM for performance. Another model you often hear is React can be used as a V in MVC. At the time, downplaying React's role in the application architecture was intentional because React had already had too many seemingly bad ideas to risk alienating people by adding some more. In fact, React is not about the virtual DOM. Its implementation detail made React famous, but it's overshadowed by other concepts that are less shiny. The problem is he only just gets the highlight right here. React's true strengths are composition, unidirectional flow, freedom from DSLs, explicit mutation, static mental model. I wish he elaborated on this, but I remember the first time I read this article, and it was way later, even after I started Solid, and I'm like, God, of course he gets it, right? Like, I don't even think he was a React core team at this time. This is just, it came obvious, I think about 2-3 years after React came out, that there was something special here that was not on the surface. It wasn't superficial. It wasn't, because we've gone through different types of APIs. We've tried different types of things here. What was so cool about React was that even as you scaled it to larger projects, and I'm not talking like hooks and stuff. Some people get like caught up on that, or class components or whatnot, was that by taking this philosophy, it just kind of saved you. It didn't matter. Like I watched early reactive libraries, Ember, Angular, those aren't reactive, but like Knockout and stuff, scale large and not have that feeling of calm. Like you felt like you were working to kind of build the thing, and each thing was its own like piece, and every part was special, and you're building the site. React kind of just was, you almost kind of gave in. You're just like, this is the approach. and you fall. I know some people might think, oh well, Angular you given too because you have like freaking a dozen different types of service things that you have to use that are all set and go to docs. No, React's giving in wasn't about specific libraries. It was just into this approach. You just kind of were like, as long as I follow these rules, do things a certain way, they'll just work. And the thing is, once people stopped fighting React, it just worked well for them and continued to. It's funny because in the early days, everyone was trying to like pull their own ideas into React, different types of state management and all that stuff, kind of almost at odds with it. And they wanted to bring those experiences that they had from other frameworks. And over time, React sort of just assimilated it all. Yes, 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 exactly. The funny thing is, I prescribe to it, and this is why I did that React Finland talk, where I was like, maybe in a different reality, the React team would have built Solid. I honestly believe that it holds the same values and principles, even if it's a different implementation, which is why I want to interact with the Dans or the Sebs or whatever, because I don't think they get it. Everyone just sees Vue or Svelte when they see Solid, and they don't realize that this is very, I mean, don't get me wrong, they see React like literally on the surface, but once they get past that level and they're like, oh, it's reactive, that's when they kind of go to it. The truth of the matter is, we don't really diverge from React's philosophy. And this is why it was kind of fun, because at the every time I try and go, oh, here's my reactive library, especially early days on Twitter, except it uses JSX, people just assume that I'd want to make it more like Vue or Svelte. And at every point I'm like, no, that's the whole point. It's not like that. I don't want two-way binding. And I'm glad more people have jumped on, so I don't have to say I anymore, and I can say we, and that sounds more powerful. And I hope people are embracing it. But every time people, there are values intrinsic here that I believe lead to success and led to React success that aren't about being easy. They aren't about just making those early steps more approachable. It's a philosophy. Yeah, so I mean, okay, that's a bit of a spiel for people, I'm sure. I'm not sure if anyone was expecting me to go on a rant here, but this is a classic article in that it's not finished, and Dan's probably almost like, you've seen his writing now. He's probably be embarrassed of this one. I've got some old embarrassing ones on Medium too, but this is really, you could tell from that even short bit that he's like, I want to start writing about React. I want to get involved. And I mean, he already was worked on Redux and stuff like that at that time, I imagine. But he wanted to gush about it because, like, at a certain point, he probably had that epiphany. He was like looking at it and going, why does this work so well? Why am I always so content where it is? And React's gone through some harder times of late, working through hooks and all this stuff, but they've kept that. And that's why you have the Kent C. Dodds of the world, kind of shouting it for the rooftop still and talking how it's simple, not easy, and all that stuff. It's just, this is what people should learn. And actually, I'll post another one in here if people care. I used to write more about this kind of stuff. And one of my earliest articles, for me, even if Dan Abramoff didn't finish the article, I hope I did, essentially. I didn't get into all the points he had, but this article is worth checking out, where I basically kind of point out that React just kind of has everything mostly right, except, arguing in my mind, like, I don't like the I don't like the implementation details. I don't like the mental model, but I love the philosophy. So I mean, it's fine. I would debate the mental model execution thing with Seb all day if he given the chance, or Dan or whoever else from that team. It's just like, the important part is, from at least a design standpoint, is just understanding the impact of these kind of subtle nuanced details here. And for me, it's a lot like designing a language. You have to you have to kind of like composition and stuff like what are we talking about here? We're writing a framework. Why are we talking about such esoteric things? It matters. I mean, so I mean, sorry, I'm not coming off here to diss Svelte. It's just interesting to me because Svelte has always challenged me because, and in Vue to a certain degree too, because they prioritize different things in their thinking. You can tell, especially with Vue. Vue was like, I want people to to be able to build websites. I want anyone to come and be able to build websites. I want you just to pick it up and just start with almost nothing and just get to where you need to get to. And in a sense, that's the goal of every JavaScript framework. But like, you could tell React right off the gate wanted to be a lifestyle. I don't know if it was there right away. I don't know when, the original creators, Jordan, et cetera, was working on it. They realized that's what they had. I mean, in a sense, you could have just said, oh, it's like Angular, except we have this VDOM thing, so our dirty checking is less expensive. I mean, that's the simple thing. But somehow, maybe by the choice of those early contributors, maintainers, the way the open source project was handled, maybe some hidden members of the team that I don't realize who were there right from the beginning, they started crafting a story that wasn't about APIs, but was about best practices. And that, to me, is way more interesting because, sure, APIs are important, surfaces matter, but to actually view it in terms of like a systematic approach is a whole other thing. Each piece part of a whole, maybe greater than the sum of its parts. That kind of design insight and thought is incredible and what makes React really cool. And I hope people who use Solid might see the same kind of aspects there because, as I said, it was a huge influence. Oh man, I don't know where I'm going anymore. As I said, I was hoping that there was. It's funny. I pick a topic that's like fairly boring and dry, and then we end up kind of off the rails here. I don't know. Anyone else have any more questions in chat? Maybe this is why I should host Twitter Spaces, because I love talking. I love getting into conversations and discussing ideas. And this sort of forces me into a monologue type scenario where I answer questions. But as you can tell, I have a lot to say on these topics, right? And I don't know. Some of it comes from most of it comes from various experiences. But I feel like in the areas that I've had a chance to dig into it, there's some insight hopefully to be gained there. Like, don't ask me about Web3. Sorry, I know nothing about Web3. But talking about JavaScript frameworks and whatnot, and the web, I feel much more comfortable with. Anyway, yeah, I don't know. That I think that's at the end of my rant. So unless someone has something else to spike it on, I think I don't know if I have anything else for you all tonight. I'm glad that we have places like Twitter where these conversations can continue, and where I can interface with people from React core team or the different frameworks. I'm really stoked to see where these new libraries are going, where they're heading. And, I love the excitement that's coming over from like Quick, with what they're working on. I'm really stoked about what's going on with Marco. We're getting really close now. I know I've been saying that for a year. I wrote the Marco artists years ago, but we're able to show people the compiled output and what it looks like. Obviously, the compiler's not finished, but like it's working, right? And that's incredible. Elaborate a little bit more on this. I mean, I remember the Cybertruck. It was when it came out, that was as divisive as it was. I remember the the people are like, what the hell is it? And some people are like, that's kind of cool how practical and pragmatic it is. But can you elaborate a little bit what you mean? I don't remember I just remember the responses. I don't remember what the reveal was. How important is separating get excited that made you agree with React on that? Yeah, I think it's super important. Like I've written articles and articles about it. I believe in its, and part of this is it comes back to that time period, but there's more reasons that are subtle to solid perhaps specifically, but like, okay, if you go back, someone asked me today, and this is relevant on Discord. You talk about knockout all the time, like it was like the golden years or something, and it kind of was for me. But you always allude to knockout dying out to React, and like you never really say why solid isn't knockout, like why it's not doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. And I did actually cover exactly that in a talk for React Finland, but it's not in much of my writing. And instead I just kind of go, oh, knockout, how I missed the, so to speak. But it is everything to do with this. And I did have a stream about two-way binding where I talked about this a little bit, but essentially sometimes something is just too powerful. And I know that's weird because I like giving people control and power, but there's a difference between giving people power and giving people control. And what I'm getting at is reactivity is so powerful. And if you do not have a virtual DOM, if you do not have even a component system, if you don't have some kind of safety net around it, you can wreak havoc. Because think about it. Because the way you can subscribe and the way you can write, anything can happen. And this is even more pronounced. Have you ever seen that old example where someone goes, okay, and I think I use this exact example somewhere else, but I'm just going to throw out the playground just because I can. But you've probably seen that example where someone writes some kind of variable and they're like, okay, here's a value, blah, blah, blah. And maybe they put something on it and they go 5, right? Or T or whatever. I type, doesn't matter. And then you call some function you import a function. You don't know what the function is. You pass your value to it. And then you go, what can you say about value.something? And let me zoom in a bit so you can see what I'm saying. What do you know about value about something now? Now, the problem is if function can mutate that value, you know nothing. You don't know if something is even on it anymore. And if you had, and if it gets worse if something was like, I can't use, it was like this. You could literally go like this and have a JavaScript error because there's no guarantee, there's no contract, there's no nothing. And sure, this is just the old argument about, immutability, right? And contracts. But the thing is, functional programming type things, some people will swear by functional programming. Some people will swear by, object-oriented or whatever. But the thing is, regardless of what the entity is, if your app grows to a certain complexity, and here's the thing, even if it's not a complexity, it's a good pattern to invoke, is ownership and data control. And this is important when you have nesting. This is important when you have trees. This is important when you have code executing in different contexts. And the problem with reactivity, and it's not like a huge problem, but is that essentially things can subscribe anywhere. And if things can also write anywhere, like how far removed do we get before we don't even realize we're dealing with a reactive value? And I went to a bigger example in the previous stream, but where I actually tried to come up with something convoluted. But these things sort of happen, like essentially, props that get drilled into other props. And And at a certain point, a local variable gets reassigned, and no one realizes that it's reactive. It's actually dangerous to have nested reactivity. Now, to be fair, we don't need nested reactivity for everything, but essentially, I wanted it very explicitly to be able to be like, if you have a reactive value, you make the decision whether the child can change it. That's what it comes down to. And React calls this unidirectional flow. Like, honestly, it's a little bit more wiring, right? And for forms, yeah, we'd like to cut that thing. But once you kind of step out past like direct binding of forms, which is clearly something that's nice, you enter a space where if you let things kind of go willy-nilly, so to speak, you can't guarantee that some assignment somewhere isn't going to cause a ripple effect through your whole app. And if those are real DOM nodes, cause crazy inefficient work. And the thing is, I'm not even talking about how should I put it? Like things that you would notice. Like maybe you end up just replacing parts of the DOM with the exact same thing and you don't even realize it. This used to happen to me in Knockout all the time. It used to happen to everyone in Knockout all the time. Once the apps got big enough. And you're like, well, why would you like Knockout so much? Well, because it started from something really simple. It had that Svelte like appeal. You just like made it valued and updated in a data bind. And don't get me wrong, Svelte doesn't really have this problem because they don't have nested reactivity, but because they don't have nested reactivity, they also don't have a whole slew of flexibility in a different way. But like essentially, the amount of damage it caused was enough. Let me see if I can find this. Another link to share in chat. Let's see if I can find React. React introduced Flux in a conference back in 2013, I want to say. Hacker Way, Rethinking Web App Development. I love this because I'm pretty sure Rich Harris's Rethinking Reactivity was partially influenced by this Rethinking Web Dev thing from Facebook. And this video, let's see if I can get to somewhere relevant, because they do a bunch of crap. This is old React, but it's at a certain point, yes, she comes on, Jing Chen, and basically explains why they use Flux at, I'll just link this in the chat, at Facebook. And I mean, this is old. It's not as relevant anymore. But what, like, I don't really have.
When we add a lot of models,
I have audio.
and when we add a lot of views.
Is this coming through? Can you actually hear the audio?
There's just an explosion of arrows.
Here we go.
And if you just look at these arrows, can you tell if there's an infinite loop here where, you know, the model triggers something in the view and the view triggers something in a different model? It goes in a cycle. It's really hard to tell just by looking at this. And that's with all of your relationships drawn out.
Can you guys hear this?
If you were to look at that in code and try to figure out, where do I have an infinite loop somewhere in here that's causing my app to just go in constant loops, it's really difficult. I was drawing a very similar diagram while I was trying to figure out the architecture of one of our more complicated interfaces. It looks very much like this. And it was so complicated that I ended up drawing numbers instead of arrows to represent the relationships between them. That's how dense the arrows were getting. So we want to do away with all of this. What we propose instead is something called Flux. It's all of the double arrows that go in both directions that make it really hard to understand the system. What we have is an action coming into the system, a dispatcher that sort of acts as the traffic controller for the whole thing, the store, which is the data layer that basically updates whenever you get a new action, and then the views re-render whenever the stores say something has changed. And then from the view side, they can throw another action back into the system.
Okay. I'm going to stop this here for a moment. But essentially, what I'm getting at is, sure, this is describing Redux or their state management solution, but in a way, it's also describing the way to think about React itself internally and the approach with the unidirectional flow. That early diagram was completely how web dev was. And the funny thing is, if you go back to this diagram, which seems crazy, it doesn't just have to be model view controller here. It could be view model, like component interest. This sort of crap happened all the time. And it was a mess. Obviously, we know better now. Our reactive systems are batched. There are improvements here, but I am a big proponent of unidirectional flow, especially when you're talking about the component of the prop drilling angle. See, something like MobX, you might arguably get away with using a like read-write proxy or something. And the reason is, the store is all defined in a single location, and then you import it into specific components, and in those components, you're interfacing with it, and those are those locations. But if you start prop drilling it, that's not good. But a lot of times with stores, you'll just have each component pull in from the store directly. But think about it. If you have deeply nested proxies and you pass them as props, or parts of them as props, any component down the tree might end up with part of it and not even realize that it's actually connected to the store. And they go, yeah, let's see if I can pull something a little further on in this example, just to explain just how
messages view and the chat tab view in sync. We also want to handle that unseen count. So this code gets a little bit more, they didn't care what else we were launching. They didn't care we were improving.
Okay, here we go.
It goes into the store. You can't put another one in until the stores are completely finished processing it. That's pretty abstract though. So let's work our way back to this. And let's use a real world example, a chat interface at Facebook. We knew that we had a problem with chat in 2011 when we introduced the subscribe button on our blog. And the first comment on that blog post was, please improve chat system, with 898 likes. And this was one of our more polite requests. We got a lot of comments that would just say fix chat. And that became a pretty frequent refrain in all of our user comments. So how do we get to this place? How do we get to the point where we were annoying our users so much, they just wanted us to fix chat? They didn't care what else we were launching. They didn't care we were improving. They just wanted us to fix chat. Well, to answer that, we have to go through sort of the chat feature as it evolved. We started with something pretty simple. You have a chat tab, shows a list of messages. Whenever you get a new chat message, you just append it. It's pretty simple. The code is pretty manageable. Later on, we also launched the messages tool, which shows you the number of threads that have unseen messages on them. That was kind of developed independently from the chat tab. But whenever a new message comes in, we also want to handle that unseen count. So this code gets a little bit more complicated. We have an unseen thread count that we want to bump every time we get a new message. And if we think that the user is looking at it, we also want to decrement it. A couple months later, we also introduced the larger messages view. And with that, we made this handler even more complicated. This is what we had before. And now we have to sort of account for the messages view and decrement the count under the right conditions if we think the user is looking at either one of the views. So what are the problems here? One is that the code really has no structure. It's very imperative. That makes it fragile. And we lose a lot of the original intent behind it. It's hard to tell just by looking at the code that you want to keep the messages view and the chat tab view in sync. It's hard to tell that you only want to increment and then decrement. You don't want to do either of those more than once.
Code is probably pretty small.
And as we add more features, this code just only gets longer.
But there's
having something imperative like this basically led us to the situation where we had our most annoying chat bug happen over and over. Users would get an unseen count, and there would be no unseen messages behind it. Everyone's sort of used to seeing one of these numbers, clicking on it, and you get something new behind it. That's exciting. But when they get that number and they click, there's nothing there. They refresh the page and it's gone. That's really annoying. It's really frustrating. And that's what led to the whole fixed chat user feedback. And it wasn't like we didn't fix the problem. We would always fix some particular edge case.
They're blocking.
But this problem would keep coming back just because the whole system was.
Let me see if I can get it on here.
System was fragile.
Okay, yeah, it's just the site.
And that was a good sign that something was fundamentally wrong here. So how can Flux help with something like this? If we're looking at the structure of the code that we had before, we have sort of the fundamental pieces. We have chat tab, main messages, an unseen counter.
Reactivity
and then we have an external
make
handler
this a
that
little
goes in and
cleaner than her
changes some of their
example,
state.
but just
Each have their own state,
we're getting
but the
somewhere.
handler goes and modifies them. Right? All of the logic to modify state based on a new message coming in is in the handler itself. And so those three different pieces no longer have the ability to maintain internal consistency. They basically don't have that information. They've already ceded that control to the handler. What we want to do instead is internalize this control. We want to move all of the control into the individual pieces so that the state is right next to the logic that updates that state. So for chat tab and main messages, it's pretty easy. You just want to append a message whenever you get a new message. But it's a little bit less clear what to do with the unseen counter. We know that you want to still increment whenever you get a new message, but where do you decrement that unseen counter? You don't have enough information at that point. What this structure makes clear is that we need more explicit data. What we really want is to keep track of a list of the unseen threads, not just the unseen count. And then what we can do is whenever a new message comes in, we can add that thread to the list. And then further down the line, we can have the UI decide when to mark that that thread as seen, and I can remove it from the thread list. Having more information this way means that that thread list stays more consistent. If we put in 2 mark seen messages, no harm done. The second one is a no op because that thread has already been removed. So what we learned here is that we should use more explicit data on the client instead of derived data. In this case, what that means is the unseen threads list is the explicit data, and the unseen count is the derived data, which is the length of that list. And doing it this way gives the client a lot more control and a better ability to stay consistent overall. We also knew that we wanted to separate data from our view state. This isn't too different from MVC. It's very non-controversial, but it does add to our system diagram a little bit. So now we have an action coming in to the messages, threads, and unseen threads state. And whenever those update, they tell the views, hey, something changed and you should go re-render. The biggest difference between Flux and MVC is that we want to avoid cascading effects by preventing nested updates. So what does that mean? Well, if we look at our system, what that means is that we want to let the data layer completely finish processing before we trigger any additional actions. In this case, it means that the actions come in, the messages, threads, and unseen threads stores finish processing that, tell the views to update, and only then can the views say, I want to mark something as seen, and that goes back in through the system. The benefit here is that there are no arrows going in the other direction. More generally, what this diagram looks like is you have an action that comes into the stores update the views, and all of your actions take the same structure. Nothing goes in the other direction. And having all of your actions go through the same flow makes it really easy to onboard a new person. When I was working on the teams that use this.
Okay, that's probably enough for this. This is an old talk, and it's funny, I realize I'm doing like a reaction video to a talk that happened in like 2013. The problem is I've actually seen it before, so it's not a reaction video. But this is, by now, this is such a well-known and understood approach that everyone does this stuff now anyways. Like, this is not new. This is not like revolutionary. It's like how you do things. But at the time, this was not the case. And I know this is a really long tangent way of doing it, but what they were basically describing, don't get me wrong, there's some details here where I think implementation mattered. I think in terms of those 3 points, the third point is the most important of the bunch. But essentially, unidirectional flow gave the control back in such a way that it actually simplified everything. Sorry, someone came back with the Cybertruck. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I see what you're saying. I don't know how to actually leverage it in the same way. But yeah, no, maybe if the problem is, solid on the surface looks like React. So this gets very nuanced, but my point is, people have kind of forgotten how big of a deal or how problematic this what actually was. Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, we've done other things systematically in the way we've approached designing our frameworks and our libraries, where this stuff isn't as bad. But God, this what React. And the funny thing is, even when this talk came out, people are still like, oh, like we still like our MVC. It's funny. Like, people just tried it and they changed the mentality and they did it, and they just realized like it just, the old approaches just evaporated within a year. Like, JavaScript kind of moves fast and stuff, but can you picture frameworks that were completely the hot thing? Like, it's hard now because we've kind of settled in, but can you picture stuff maybe not as big as React or Vue or Angular, but picture something like Svelte, for example. And I'm sorry, they use Svelte again or Solid. Maybe Solid's even a better example. Where, like, picture a framework like that coming in, being super hot for like 2 years. Like, Svelte's a good example because it's been 2 years since 2019, and then literally disappearing in 6 months and no one using it anymore. This was what was happening back in 2014, 15, because people just realized, they're like, this isn't quite right. React actually has it right. So it's kind of crazy because React came in on that, and some people, like, they saved us from two-way binding, and people are like, I want it back, I don't think anyone coming up now will ever suffer the scars in the same way to have such a harsh bias. But it's kind of one of those things where, like, functional programming, you find like certain people just gravitate towards it just because of, like, it kind of academically makes sense to them, and it falls through. This is one of those things where there was a real issue, it was a real problem, and we've kind of continued on this path just because it made sense. And now it's fine. Level 0, level 1, thinking of frameworks, two-way binding makes life a lot easier, but it's just not something that I'm at all interested in Solid. And I mean, I maybe this is my bias showing through. It's just like, this is still very real to me, and maybe I've been at this too long. That's the problem. You get people who've been around too long, they have those kind of biases. It's kind of like I was making fun of the classic MPA people in my latest article, calling them time travelers. It can work the opposite way too, right? It doesn't have to always just refer to people set in, like, the old ways were so good. Sometimes this follows the bias the opposite way, where you're saying the old ways were so bad, don't go there. And this is something I personally kind of have to kind of work through, because, like, because of, like, .NET, I really hated class life cycles and, like, class components and, like, lifecycle functions. So when I saw React, I rejected it almost immediately, because I was like, oh my God, .NET back, but now in JavaScript, this is the worst thing imaginable. But now I've come to really like React. And someone might go, well, it's because React has hooks and ended up resembling your favorite libraries. But I think I would have come around on React even if they didn't like hooks. Obviously, things would have been a little bit different. But essentially, what I'm getting at is, we have to be careful of our, like, negative biases as well. It's also very easy to just be like, oh, this is a bad pattern, don't do it. So that's why it is important to understand that, like, Svelte is a bit different, and largely that's because they don't have nested reactivity. I mean, that kind of helps the thing, but, like, in general, as things grow, these are just good patterns. And I mean, you always hear those stories about like WhatsApp, or like some of the large telecom, and they use these, like, systems that basically never go down, never have errors, and, like, are perfect. I'm trying to forget, was it Elixir or Phoenix or something behind it? It basically, they're designed in such a way, Erlang of some sort, I think, where, like, using these really strict functional programming things, there's just no room for error. And I mean, that's an extreme, but when you kind of have these patterns that are so well structured, there's just value when things scale to a certain level, and maybe that's not a scale everyone hits, so maybe don't worry about it. But I think I think it's really hard for people today to kind of get back to the mindset to and I'm hoping we haven't forgot the mistakes of the past. That's what Solid's all about. But maybe I'm being a bit too conservative. There could be setter limitations outside of creating a second identifier, but yeah, and that's the thing, right? Someone was like, "Can we just do this locally and then make it not escape the template, right? Can we make it mutable within the template and not escape?" And one way, the way Svelte does it, is don't make things nested, right? It's almost impossible to share reactivity in Svelte. Like you can use their stores, but like their core label stuff, it's like really hard to actually. You have the bind syntax, but which is explicit and kind of okay. But generally speaking, it's actually really hard to share reactivity in Svelte. And I actually did a little hack where I did do that, and I showed that I think in a previous stream. And yeah, everything broke apart. It was like terrible. I could basically ignore binding and have child components update parent components and just cause a whole bunch of havoc. So the trick is like, is it possible to have it use the convenient assignment syntax locally, but then make it have to be explicit when you leave the template? And not easily, maybe a smart enough compiler or some kind of way of doing it. But the problem is you still need to give the end user the syntax to make the decision to just pass a setter or not pass a setter. So, obviously this Svelte way is very obvious because you can't pass the reactivity of the template generally. So you can just pass a function down, which becomes a setter, and you can make it explicit that way. But it's not. I think if you could do some clever playing, you could probably come up with something. But it's not actually, like Vue has a special helper to make things read only, but I don't think it's enforceable essentially. Feels similar to show suspense giving the parent control, where similarly it's nice to explicitly pass the setter as a permission. Yeah, yes, those are interesting. Suspense is particularly interesting because suspense has a sort of weird inversion where the parent gets to decide the behavior, but the child gets to choose whether it wants to play. I actually love suspense from that design. I think that's one of those genius things, and I think we gotta thank Seb for that one probably. But like when you attack the async problem, your first tendency is to look at where the fetching happens or the async starts. But what we really want when building UIs is understanding the consistency of our application of our view. So using suspense to invert it actually puts the onus back on where the values are read and where they use it. And the funny thing is, this is such a natural thing for reactivity that it fits like a glove. I mean, some of this is the interesting thing for me, which is I said when talking with Sebastian and how he has like this different view of things. The stuff they've been designing for React for the last couple years since hooks and this whole direction is so similar to reactive fine-grained stuff that I'm almost able to adopt these ideas just straight up because they're analogous. They're almost identical, and it's really quite powerful because it's almost like these ideas were made for reactivity, almost better for reactivity. That's why I've been able to do this stuff so easily, because like it's almost like the new ideas coming out for React were made for Solid. Anyway, sorry, kind of went on my rants again, but I hope that answers that question. I know that went on a crazy tangent and somehow spent 40 minutes on it, but there's so much depth in this area, and when you kind of go through the progression, I'm not sure if developers coming up today really do appreciate it. I mean, that makes me sound like an old man, like the MPA people. So I don't want to, as I said, I don't want to get kind of pulled into that. But essentially, there are some lessons to be learned and put in perspective. Biggest thing for me, though, is, as I said, this doesn't mean don't bet on JavaScript or don't bet on reactivity or whatever. Like, don't assume the solutions are the same today as they are tomorrow. Okay. Sure. I'll shoot. One thing I don't understand about two-way binding is why people want them that much. Isn't it essentially just about passing one prop instead of two props? Why is this such a big deal? Yeah, I mean, it is an ease of life thing, really. Like, I I showed the controllable uncontrollable thing in the last stream, and when you looking at like how cool Marco handles controllable, that's an argument for two-way binding. Like, and that is one where it actually drastically simplifies knowledge to be able to make something controlled or not controlled. And like, because making either or is easy, but making both is extremely complicated. But as we saw in the stream, Svelte, Vue, Solid, once you leave the either or scenario, the uncontrolled is easy. It just works. But once you leave the either or scenario, and controlled is easy. It's two-way binding in those frameworks. But once you leave that, they're all the same. You have to handle everything yourself, and it's extremely complicated. And at that point, yeah, I mean, it is, if you ignore that controllable thing from Marco, it is just adding that extra function. And the small things that happen, a really big kind of deal. Yeah, that's the thing. People like that in Svelte, you type just a few less characters. It looks cleaner, these kind of aesthetic stuff. I'm not gonna lie. I did a survey a while ago because honestly, and I mean, this is about me again trying to value stuff. I don't care that you type less characters as Svelte. Like that's like the last thing that I value. I've sometimes maybe been a bit harsh and called that kind of like superficial, like people not caring about what's important. But these kind of, you have to live with your code as a developer. You have to like sit with it. You have to type it. You have to do this thing. For me, a much more important consideration of writing less code is the refactor story and composability and things that actually matter for the long term. But for the immediate gains, typing less code is the easiest feel-good thing you can do, right? Like, not having to add that extra, completely unnecessary, like on input event to write back to the input. Like, sure, it only took you 15 seconds to add it or something, but the fact that you had to add it is kind of tedious. People don't like tedious things. They could have just went like bind input and called it a day, score. That's not the hill I'm going to die on though, because like it took you 15 seconds. It's explicit. Now you have control. In some ways it's kind of better. It's funny. I was a big fan of two-way binding coming out of Knockout and stuff, and not having it, something was like, oh, why do I have to keep on doing this thing? But so like it definitely has this emotional feel or connection. But on the other hand, like, I mean, I'm not that spoiled. You know what I mean? Like, and again, old man talking, so to speak, but it's just like, does it really matter? No, like, not having to write quotes on HTML attributes seems weird. Someone actually wanted this out of the JSX spec. Marco does this. HTML supports not quotes on some stuff, but this is another one of those kind of funny ones where you have to worry about consistency, right? Because on the time you do need quotes, well, then you do need quotes. People really do try and do less stuff. See, if you remove those things, there's less places where you can make a typo, less places where you can make a small mistake. I know this from like CoffeeScript mentality. There's this thinking that you can just move faster because the simple stuff you're less likely to screw up. So, I mean, there is some value there, and yeah, I didn't realize how much boilerplate until I started using Copilot. Yeah, like maybe Copilot's the solution. I mean, there is repetition, but it's also like, who are you writing the code for? You're writing, like, it's not just for you to implement, it's also for people to read. Code is read. So I mean, it's funny because people know that I was a big fan of CoffeeScript and its terseness, but as I said, it's such a funny game to go to on the extreme that I've seen all extremes. Like if someone wants to write the least amount of code, go use Marco and terse mode. Like literally nothing is smaller than Marco and terse mode. Like some people like kind of measuring less code. Like there is literally nothing smaller. But we don't use Marco and terse mode generally because like it's kind of like less readable or less approachable. I don't know. I think people have their preferences. I don't think I can really judge them for that, or anyone can really judge them for that. I have a hard time thinking that it's actually important, so I'm probably the worst person to ask. You can ask Alexis why he created solid labels. The my opinion on this probably is not the best take. Mixed mode. Oh, you talking for like Marco's thing or what? Sorry, not quite sure which mixed mode you're talking about. But anyway, yeah. Being able to like kind of play back and forth. Yeah, I think that's cool. But as I said, like people have preferences. They like typing less. It's the first place you get that immediate win. I don't think in the long run it actually matters that much, but maybe it does. Maybe every 15, 20 seconds adds up. That's just a little mental tax bearing at you. It's not the thing that I think should be making the biggest decision. But again, if I did, maybe I would have created Svelte, except I would have stopped shortcuts Svelte already existed, and maybe that's where I'd be. I said it's all about valuing different things. But why do people want it so bad? Yeah, I mean, it's just that like nice little piece of syntax, that ease of life feature. I can live without it pretty easily, but for some people, it's just so nice that it's just like that icing on the cake. It's hard for me to unsee the danger behind it, but here's the thing: two-way binding to a form is not ever going to be like detrimental, like I'm talking about. The problem is when you add two-way binding to components and other things, and you can like pass things through trees and whatnot. Two-way binding on a form is safe. Like there's nowhere else it can go. It can only go to that form. Yeah, I think that answers that one. My margarita is finished. I think they don't defy or don't define best practices. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole conversation to be had about the Ease of Life things. One of the ones for me, and I didn't really bring it up on the last stream that much, but I personally think the reason I had such a hard time with the Vue docs was because of all the shorthands. They made things so easy that there was like so many different syntaxes. As someone who is not familiar, it was a lot. Now, what's weird about that is I understand how Vue basically works, and I know basically what the shorthands are. So I should be able to make heads or tails of like the pattern and apply it. So it's not like this is like super beginner guy trying to do like a super advanced thing. It's just that there's just so much. I had to wade through it and know in my mind to go, okay, disregard that or translate that in my head. And that's a perfect example of this sort of ease of life thing. Special syntaxes. We have to consider this a lot with Marco, because Marco actually defines different syntax in standard HTML. And there's only a couple, and we've reduced it. But Marco was like king for that kind of stuff at one point. They just had shorthand syntaxes for everything. And over time, we've actually stepped back from those and only focused on the things that were mechanically important. And again, I don't know if that's the right choice for everyone, but that's where it's templating language and ultimately ended up, simply because the desire to actually add things that were needed to HTML. So yeah, I mean, like let me see if I can pull it up here. I probably not actually. Let's see, do I have my bookmarks? It's funny when I'm in this full screen, I can never see it. I don't think I actually bookmarked the the poll. I did a poll a while back where I actually asked that question, and yeah, I didn't bookmark it. Sorry. Yeah, it's fine. Just like the thing was, most people were like two-way binding where it's convenient. I think the results were 40%. And then about equal number of people were like, I need two-way binding to live, and then two-way binding is an abomination. And then I forget what the fourth option was, but essentially, so yeah, I don't know what two-way binding is, which I quite enjoyed. I think Dan Abramoff was like, I don't know what two-way binding is. A lot of we'd gone to such a point that two-way binding wasn't even a term in our vernacular, but it's kind of come back again because of the popularity of Svelte and Vue kind of bringing it to the limelight. onChange. Is this what I think it is? Do you want me to talk about onChange? Oh man. If there was one thing that React did that I am like heatedly upset about, and I know this is a silly thing, is the change event. They commandeered the change event. It's like the worst because the browser doesn't like the browser change event works on Blur. I had someone put something in our Discord, and they were like, why doesn't this work? And it was a perfectly fine example, but essentially when they clicked the button, it worked, but when they press enter, it didn't. And the reason was, when you click a button, you have to leave the input to click the button, which caused the change event to fire and handled the change. But when they clicked enter, their cursor was still inside, so the change event hadn't fired, and they were seeing empty to-dos. And honestly, every live stream that we've ever, like new person coming in, they hit this stupid thing because of React commandeering onChange. And the challenge there is, what are the other popular libraries other than React? So React has an onChange event instead of onInput, which is, as I said, not correct. Then you have Vue, Angular, and Svelte, who all have two-way bindings. So the developers never actually bother writing like onChange event or onInput event, which is what it should be. So essentially, there's a whole generation of web developers coming up who don't understand that onChange is a Blur event, and they think that it's an input per keystroke input event, where that's what onInput is for. And I as one person can't, fight that wave. It's funny. Inferno, Preact, I guess Lit, all obviously require an onInput. Maybe Lit has two-way binding, which would explain it. But essentially, it's kind of insurmountable in a kind of crazy way, that because none of the popular frameworks actually use the proper input event, no one like knows about it. I don't know if there's much else to rant about that, but it's strange. I literally every new user to Solid probably hits this, or on a stream hits this, because even if they're a Vue user or whatnot, like maybe they think React, or they've seen enough React to at least be aware there's an onChange event. So I don't know. That one's just a little gripe. But you know what? I think the questions here have kind of wound down. We're at the 3-hour mark for a stream that was literally about deployment and pretty much probably bored everyone's socks off until we started talking about more interesting topics. So I'm fine with that. Is part of React's effort to make different HTML elements have a similar API? Well, early days. There's this, again, hard for people now to kind of, as much, like browsers used to be like crazily inconsistent and different. That's where the synthetic events came from. They did want to try and make a standardized event system. In terms of the elements themselves, I don't know so much, but essentially like it was common for libraries like jQuery and stuff to have polyfills and have to deal with all the weird stuff like, oh, in Safari this happens, and in Internet Explorer these 7 things happen or don't happen. And essentially the early frameworks had to make a choice to follow the spec to as well. Like it was impossible. They couldn't actually, if they followed the spec, then every browser that wouldn't work. So they'd have to patch and hack stuff together. And I think it probably at a certain point they were just like, screw all of you. I'm going to just make something that works, and because I made it, I know that nothing else, is going to mess with it. I can just make sure that I patch every browser. And what sucks is that requires more code in the framework, and it's those kind of things is why like React can't shed some of its weight. But in a sense, this, we're looking back at it now and going, oh man, why didn't they get rid of it when they had a chance or whatever? Why did they go down this path? And they probably regret it to a certain degree themselves, but we're still kind of do this to this day to a certain degree. We use the part of the web platform that's convenient for us, because it makes sense. Not because, like it's the right thing to do. Some web component supporters might be like, oh, frameworks bad, blah blah blah, not using the platform. But it's like, no, use the platform. We just use the parts of the platform that are actually good. And I mean, that's a little bit of a friction, but clearly it's been going on since day one. So things are getting there eventually. I mean, using the platforms in our benefit, it makes the code smaller. The more inbuilt tools we can use, the less we have to rely on like building all these polyfills and stuff ourselves, which makes our framework bigger and bloated. No one wants a bigger bloated framework, right? So I think I think React had good reason at the time. It wasn't so unconventional. It's just years later, like it's just so widespread they can't change it. It's just really unfortunate that people literally don't know this fact. All right. Last chance to get another question in, but I think we're going to call it now. I'm betting that since the viewers have seemed to kind of move on, that there probably won't be that many. But thank you for those who have actually stayed till the end on this roller coaster stream. I'm going to need to come up with some good topics coming up here in the future, so we can kind of look at something, maybe get a guest on. If you have any suggestions, people interested in joining me on my stream, I'm super stoked to. I'm like to probably could do an interesting stream about the router if we could get Ryan on here. He seems to be in the stream tonight, but maybe we could schedule time for that. Also get Alexis on, talk about headless or whatnot. Yeah, it's yeah, don't yeah. So if you have any ideas for the stream, throw them in, whatnot. As I said, I have a feeling this one might not be the most popular one, but hopefully some of you found some useful stuff in here and don't mind hearing me ramble and rant. But yeah, other than that, yeah, let's call it a night. All right. So thanks for joining me, and until next time, probably next week. I'm hoping I've got JSConf India Monday, like early Monday morning. I'm hoping that's public. I can share that out. I'm pretty excited about that one. It's a whole talk about reactivity in a lot of detail and in really kind of concise and hopefully clear way than I've done in the past. So I think that's a great one to pick up on. But yeah, other than that, until next week. See y'all.